Okay, so hello and welcome to the tutorial on proof-theoretical approaches to logical argumentation. My name is Ofer Arieli, and together with Strasser, we will give this tutorial. You can see our pictures in the small boxes and of the Zoom and also in this slide. And in fact, there is another reason for putting this picture on the slide, and this is because of the location of this picture. It was taken in Israel, near the Dead Sea, the lowest place on earth, and at the beginning of the snake path leading to Masada Mountain, a very beautiful place. And you also have a good opportunity to visit this and other nice places in Israel, because well, the next KR is planned to be in Haifa, Israel, as part of the Federated Logic Conference, FLOC, on August next year. So you are all welcome to submit papers to KR or any other conference in the FLOC and visit Israel. So far with the promotion, and let's now go to the tutorial itself. So the purpose or the main goals of this tutorial are the following. We would like to present some logic-based method to argumentation theory, to consider arguments and their effect on representing conflict between argument and counter-argument, to give some proof-theoretical method to reasoning with logical argumentation, some characterizations of argumentation-based reasoning, and to give some results about relations to other forms of structural argumentations and non-monotonic reasoning. So this tutorial is planned for half a day, and it is divided to 2 sessions. Each one will last about 2 hours or so, and we shall have a break. Again, about half an hour. We shall see later how long it will be exactly. So I will give the first session, which is more of an introduction nature. So it will consist of introduction to argumentation theory, some definitions about sequence-based argumentations and basic considerations, basic properties, some words about rationality postulates and relation to reasoning with maximal consistency. The second session given by Christian will be of a more advanced material, and it will cover issues like dynamic proof theory and its applications and comparison to related formalisms, argumentation-based formalism like aspect systems, and more generally non-monotonic reasoning like default assumption, etc. The material of this tutorial is also mainly included in the survey paper that was recently published as a chapter 12 of the second volume of the Handbook of Formal Argumentation, also as a paper in the Journal of Applied Logic. So you can as well look at these sources. And also we plan to put these the slides of this presentation later on, maybe next week, on the website of the tutorial. Okay, some more information about this session. So as I said, we shall start with some introduction to argumentation theory to those who are less familiar with this material. So I will start to talk generally about abstract argumentation frameworks, their semantics according to Jung, then structure argumentation, and more specifically, sequence-based argumentation. The second part of the first session will be about representation considerations, how to extend the expressive power of the theory some consistency and minimality considerations about argument, some alternative formalizations of the attack rules, etc. And the last part of this session will be about general properties that are related to reasoning. So as you see, we have three parts: introduction, representation, considerations, and some considerations about reasoning. And the third part will be also the starting point of the next session. Okay, according to Wikipedia, argumentation is a disciplinary study of how conclusion can be reached through logical reasoning. It includes the arts and the sciences of civil debates, dialogue, conversation, and persuasion. It studies rules of inference, logic, and procedural rules in both artificial and real-world settings. And at least in the context of artificial intelligence, a well-accepted representation of argumentation theory is due to Dung. So Dung defined what he calls argumentation framework as a pair consisting of arguments and attack between arguments. So this can be seen as a directed graph, actually, whose nodes are arguments, and the arrows or the edges, the directed edges, represent attacks between arguments. And these simple representations turns out to be a very successful one in the context of artificial representation, in particular modeling, defeasible reasoning, and etc. So let's consider a simple, very simple scenario to demonstrate the main idea. So suppose that we know that Alice is good at math. She got 90%, 95%. This is represented in the graph by node called denoted A. Then we have another information that Bob said that Alice copied the test. So this is a kind of a counter argument. In some sense, it attacks the information in the node called A. And then suppose we know another, we get another information that Bob is a well-known liar, which again weakens the argument in node B. So what can be deduced from this abstract argumentation framework? Well, since C is not challenged by any counter argument, we can accept it. Now, B is attacked by an accepted argument, so it should be rejected. And A is attacked only by a rejected argument, so there is no real reason to reject it, so we again accept it. So this demonstrates perhaps the two main principles in abstract argumentation framework. One is the notion of defense. So C here defends argument A because it attacks its attacker. And the other important notion is that of conflict freeness. We see that both accepted arguments A and C do not contradict each other. So there are no conflicts between accepted arguments. Okay, so this means, in fact, that a set of accepted arguments called extensions can stand together in the sense that no argument in the extension attacks another argument in the same extension. So we call this extension conflict-free, and the extended stand on its own in the sense that any argument attacking an argument in the extension is counterattacked by some argument in the extension. So the extension defends all its elements. Here is another example, and we see here, for instance, that the extensions consisting of the node B and D is indeed conflict-free and defends all its elements. So this is, in fact, the basic idea behind doing semantics. And in more details, suppose that we have an abstract argumentation framework, again, a directed graph. Let's denote by A some argument, some node in the graph, and E some set of arguments. Then we denote by A plus all the arguments or the nodes that are attacked by A, by E plus the set of arguments that are attacked by some argument in E. And similarly, the minus means the opposite. So A minus is the set of all the arguments that attack A, and similarly for E minus. And the set of arguments that are defended by E are just the arguments whose attackers are counter-attacked by some element in E. In this sense, E defends A, or all the arguments, the other arguments that E. Okay, so here are the basic notions behind the semantic. Suppose that we have a set of arguments. So the set is called conflict-free if there are no attacks between arguments inside the sets in E. It is free if it is maximally conflict-free with respect to the subset relation. It is called admissible if it is both conflict-free and defends all its arguments. It is complete if it's conflict-free and defends exactly its argument. So in particular, a complete extension is both conflict-free and admissible. Grounded extension is a minimal complete extension, again, with respect to the subset relation. Preferred extension is a maximal complete extension with respect to the subset relation. Stable extensions are extensions whose range are maximal. Range is this, exactly this expression. So it's the extension union the argument that it attacks. So a stable extension, in fact, attacks anything not in the set. And semi-stable extension is a complete extension which is maximal, whose range is maximal, again with respect to the subset relation. So to demonstrate this notion, let's consider again the abstract argumentation framework that we've seen earlier. So here the grounded extension is the empty set, and we have two preferred extensions. One of them is A. Note that the different colors in the graph here actually represent another way of giving semantics to the argumentation framework, and it's in fact called three-valued labeling. So instead of saying that A is preferred extension, we can give a label to each argument in the graph. And here the labeling is that A is accepted, labeled in, B is rejected, labeled out, and the other arguments are undecided. They have some kind of intermediate value. But this is just as a note. I will not refer in what follows to labeling semantics. It's just a note that there is another way of interpreting this argumentation framework, actually an equivalent way of interpreting this argumentation framework. And so A is one of the preferred extensions, and the set BD is another preferred extension of this framework. And note that this set is also the only stable, and therefore only the only semi-stable extension in this case, because the set attacks all the other arguments not in the set. So in fact, there are some relations between the different extensions. So stable extensions, in particular semi-stable extensions, which is in turn a preferred extension. By their definition, grounded extension and preferred extensions are complete extensions. And as I said, the complete extension is also admissible, and all of them are in particular conflict-free. In the footnote, you can see some survey paper that describes all these relations and also consider some further semantics of abstract argumentation frameworks. Okay, one of the basic notions that are related to abstract argumentation frameworks is what can be inferred, what can be entailed by a framework. And again, we use Gang semantics in order to define entailments that are induced by abstract argumentation framework. So suppose again that we have a framework and let's denote by SEM of this framework all the SEM extensions of the extensions of the same type of the abstract argumentation framework, where SEM can be either complete, grounded, preferred, stable, or semi-stable extensions. So once we fix this semantics of the framework, we can define the entailment or the argument that can be deduced by this framework. And we have basically two kinds of entailment. One is a skeptical entailment, where an argument follows from an argumentation framework according to a specific semantics if it belongs to every extension of that semantics. So it's in the intersection of all the extensions of the same semantics. And credulous entailments are entailments that are defined by the union of the extensions of the same semantics. So A follows from a particular argumentation framework if it belongs to at least one of the extensions of the same type. So again, just to demonstrate these notions by a very simple case, suppose that we have this argumentation framework, then the grounded semantics in this case consists of B, and the preferred stable and semi-stable extension in this case are A1 and B, or A2 and B. So according to the entailment that I just defined, we see that B follows from A, from this framework, according actually to all the semantics, and according to the two kinds of entailments. While if we take skeptical entailments, then we cannot infer anymore A1 and we cannot infer also A2 because they are not in the intersection of all the extensions of the same type. Okay, so far for abstract argumentation. Now let's turn to logical argumentation and sequence-based frameworks, which are actually the main subject of this tutorial. So while in abstract argumentations, arguments are of totally abstract nature, we didn't say anything particular about the representation of a general argument, except that it is a node in a graph. In structured argumentation, arguments are they have a specific structure, usually using some formal language. And in logical argumentation, moreover, arguments represent explicit inferences. So we have some underlying logic, and according to which we make inferences, and those inferences are represented, are the arguments of logical argumentation framework. And in the early stages of defining logical argumentation framework, Bernard and Hunter defined an argument just as a pair consisting of gamma and psi. Okay, so suppose that we have some background knowledge S, set of propositional formula. So a argument based on this set S is a pair where the first component in the pair, called the support set of the argument, is a finite subset of S, and the other component, called the conclusion of A, is some propositional formula such which follows according to classical logic from the support. And moreover, it is assumed that the support is the subset minimal, a subset minimal and classically consistent set which entails psi. Okay, so we actually, in this definition, make some assumptions on an argument. So we assume first that the support is classically consistent. We also assume that it is minimal in the sense that there is no subset of the support that entails the conclusion. We use propositional formulas as actually the classical language for representing formulas of arguments. And we use classical entailment for the inferences and therefore for the argument. And the questions are, all these restrictions really needed? So in our context, we make some generalizations. So the answer is no. So we extend our framework to, or in general, logical argumentation is now common to extend the language to arbitrary propositional formulas. So we use arbitrary propositional language, and in some cases also first order languages. But here we will stick to the propositional case to demonstrate the main idea. We extend our attention to arbitrary, usually effectively computable logic, not necessarily classical logic. And the two assumptions about the support set are listed. So the support set need not be minimal, nor it should be consistent. So let's elaborate on these issues. So first of all, the language, or the logic, sorry. The first extension is that the underlying logic need not be classical logic. We may use other logics as the base logic, and here we use the common definition of a logic, which is very essential in our case, which is actually a pair consisting of the underlying language, denoted here by L, and a consequence relation, Tarskian consequence relation, which is required to be reflexive. So if we assume something, we should conclude it. Monotonic, so if we add some more assumption, we still can infer the conclusion. Note that monotonicity is assumed only on the base logic, and the logic that are inferred by the abstract argumentation or the logical argumentation framework, the entailment that are inferred by the logical argumentation framework are not necessarily monotonic, but the base logic is always monotonic and transitive. So if we can use some lemmas in order to infer some further consequences. And sometimes it's also common or usual to assume some other properties of the consequence relation. So first is it should be structural, namely it should be closed under substitutions, non-trivial, so we cannot infer anything from everything, and finitary in the sense that if we can conclude something from a set, then it is possible to conclude the same thing from some finite subset of the assumption. This is, of course, related to the compactness properties of the logic and the ability to make counter arguments in a feasible way. Okay, the second extension is related to, okay, I see that there is a question. Yes, so please interrupt me. Feel free to interrupt me. So unmute yourself, and whenever you like to ask questions. So Jack, I see that you have some question.
Yes, you're talking about substitution. Is it related to first order variable? Because you said before that you were limited to propositional logic. I'm not sure what substitution means here.
It could be related, of course. Substitution is general notion that could be related also to first order logic, but here we confine ourselves, we limit ourselves to substitutions in the propositional level. So for instance, if we know that I don't know, P implies P or Q, then also R implies R or Q. So you can substitute any atomic formula by propositional formula. So make a uniform substitutions of all the of any variable that you write. Okay. So we don't get here into general most general unifiers, etc. But this, of course, can be applied also in the context of first order logic. But as we confine ourselves to propositional logic, then we just allow any substitution in the propositional level.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The second generalization is that the limits need not be a standard propositional one. So, of course, we can define, we can have, for instance, syntactical definition for the basic connectives, as you see here, or add more connectives like modal connective, etc. So here, for instance, you see that according to the definition that you see here, we just require that implication will be deductive and need not be two-valued, etc. Also, here is a very weak requirement about negation, which could be strengthened, of course. So, for instance, according to when we define negation, we can add other requirements concerning, for instance, double negation or other definitions of conjunctions and disjunctions when the left-hand side or right-hand side of the entailment is not necessarily a singleton, and so forth and so on. So we do not have to confine ourselves only to limit ourselves only to the usual classical connect. The final generalization that we make here is that it's about the assumption that support minimality and consistency is not really needed, or at least not always needed. And this follows from several reasons. First of all, it is not really realistic. In real life situations, the argument supports are neither minimal nor consistent. For instance, in many legal systems or even medical systems, consistency should not be assumed. Minimality doesn't hold in proofs, in mathematical proofs. So proofs are still valid even if they are not minimal, etc., etc. And also, if we require minimality and consistency, then increased computational complexity is involved. So checking inconsistency and checking minimality is computationally demanding. And again, here in the footnote, you can see one of the papers that explains the computational complexity of these properties in different cases. And also these properties are not always desirable because of practical reasons. And in fact, minimality and consistency, as we shall see later, can be taken care of at the level of the argumentation frameworks instead of in the level of the arguments themselves. So by using special attack rules, as we will see later on, we can, in many cases, take care of these requirements without the need to, without requiring the and on the level of the argument themselves. So we shall come back to this later on. So what really matters for an argument is that the conclusion would logically follow from the support set, and that there would be an effective way of constructing and identifying arguments. These are the two properties that are really needed for argument. We cannot live without them. And we claim that the other properties are not always necessary. So this leads us to the definition of an argument in our sense. So suppose that we are given a logic, an argument with respect to that logic, which is based on a set of assumptions, is a pair. Again, a pair where the support is a finite subset of the set of assumptions, and the only requirement is actually that the conclusion of the argument will logically follows according to the base logic from the support of the argument. And this naturally leads us to the notion of sequence, okay? Because we can borrow the well-known notion of sequence from proof theory, notion formed by Gerhard Gentzen. And we can use or associate arguments with sequence and use the usual notion of a sequence by the double arrow. So gamma double arrow psi means an argument whose support is gamma and whose conclusion is psi. So we shall sometimes denote gamma by support of the argument and psi by conclusion of the argument. And the set of all the arguments that are formed from S is denoted by this notation, okay? Arg LS are all the arguments according to L whose supports are subset of the S, of the set of assumptions. Okay, so arguments should be syntactical objects of the form of sequence that are effectively computed by a proof system. So we will assume that we have some way of constructing arguments by proof system that we shall see shortly. And it is refutable by the attack relations of argumentation system. So for this, we shall form eliminated rules that will be, by using these rules, we will be able to refute arguments. Okay, so standard sequence calculi are used to construct arguments, as I said, as I have just said. We are constructing argument from simple arguments by the means of inference rules. So, as you all know, I suppose a general notation of an inference rules is as follows. So we have some set of assumptions that should be satisfied in order to apply the rules. So gamma one. So this n sequence should hold in order to infer the sequence below the bar line. Okay, so here is some example. So we suppose that we have classical logic as our base logic and some very simple contradictory set of assumptions, P not P Q, then we can infer some arguments like P implies P, PQ implies either conduction. We can infer some tautological arguments and also arguments that follows from a contradictory support sets, etc. So one of the advantages of having sequence is that we, for many logics, or at least the base ones, we have sound and complete sequence calculi. For instance, for classical logic, you see here the well-known calculus LK that allows us to actually produce all the arguments that are valid in classical logic. So this calculus consists of axioms, some structural rules that allows us to weaken a sequence from on both sides, apply the cut rules, and some logical rules that allows us to introduce the connectives on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side of the sequence. And once we have such calculus, we of course can make derivations, which, for instance, looks as follows. So we have a kind of a reverse tree where the root is the arguments that we want to infer. For instance, this is one of the Morgan rules, and the leaves are some axioms that we want to use in order to make the derivations. An important remark is that derivations are monotonic processes. So for instance, any internal node in this tree actually could be the root of the tree, in the sense that it is derived and it remains derivable also later on in the derivation. So we just add more sequences as the derivation progresses. However, in the next session, Christian will talk about dynamic derivations, which are non-monotonic processes that allow us to retract our arguments. Okay, so in that sense, these extensions by dynamic derivations will allow us to imitate non-monotonic reasoning by logical argumentation. Okay, so this is these rules, the inference rules, are used in order to create arguments. How we represent attacks? For this, we use what we call elimination rules. So attack or elimination rules between arguments have a similar structure, but the main difference is that the conclusion of the rule is the elimination of one of the sequence, because it is attacked by other arguments. Another arguments or other arguments, so it could be singular or plural. Note that in all the rules, we assume that the support of the attacked argument is not empty, so the attacked arguments are not tautological. Here is an example of an elimination rule called undercut. So suppose that we have the green sequence gamma 1 implies psi 1, and we have another sequence or another argument which is colored red, gamma 2 and gamma 2 prime implies psi prime. If the conclusion of the attacker, namely psi 1, is equivalent to some to a negation of some of a conjunction of some support set of the attacked argument, then we can apply this elimination rule. Okay, so the conclusion of the attacker and some subset of support of the attacked argument cannot live together. For instance, in our previous example, argument like not P implies not P attacks according to undercut an argument like P implies P, because again we have the double negation rules, which allows which shows that the double negation of P is again P not P implies not P, and we also have the converse attack, which follows by the double negation rule. So in this case, not P double arrow no P attacks P double arrows P, and vice versa, because both implications of both equivalence hold according to classical logic. And also not P implies not P attacks P, Q implies P and Q, etc. So these are specific applications of undercut. And we also have other attack rules. For instance, defeat is similar to undercut, but we have a weaker condition. So instead of the double arrow, we just replace it by an implication in one direction. Also, we have direct versions of these rules where the attack is not on a subset of the attacked argument, but on a direct or a specific formula in the support of the attack rule. And we also can define many other rules like rebuttal. Rebuttal means that the conclusions of the attacked argument and the attacking arguments are contradictory. Defeating rebuttal, again, is a little bit weaker. Instead of equivalence, we replace it by implication, one-sided implication. And consistently undercut actually allows us to attack arguments whose support is inconsistent. This will play an important role in later propositions. Of course, there are some relations between those rules, as is shown here. Again, you can see in the footnote some reference to a paper which shows the relations between these rules in the context of classical logic, but there are some other relations that still hold also when the underlying logic need not be classical, as shown in this slide. Okay, now we can define what sequence-based argumentation are. So a sequence-based argumentation framework for a set S based on the logic L and a set A of attack rules is just an argumentation framework in the previous sense, where the nodes now are arguments, S-based arguments, and attacks are applications of the attack rule on the argument. So here again is a simple example. Suppose again that we have this very simple contradictory set of assumptions, P, no, P, and Q. And suppose we are using, again, classical logic and undercut as the sole attack rule. Then you can see here part of the sequence-based logical argumentations that is obtained from these from S. So for instance, you can see that the tautological argument P or not P actually defends Q implies Q from the attack of this of the argument P not P implies not Q, because again intuitively, because the attacker is based on inconsistent set of supports. So again, we can apply here the usual Dunk semantics. We have the notion of attack, as I defined previously. Defense, again, if any attacker is counterattacked by the set. Conflict freeness, no attack between the argument of the same set. Admissibility, again, means that the set is conflict-free and defends all its argument. Completeness, it's a admissible set which defends exactly its arguments, all its arguments. Grounded extensions here, in this case, you see the grounded extension, which consists of these are the preferred extensions. So we have two preferred extensions, maximally consistent sets here, and two stable extensions, which are actually the same as the preferred extensions. And here you see the grounded extensions with the minimal complete extensions in this case. Here is a little bit more complicated example. So we use now direct defeat and consistency undercut together with this a bit bigger set of assumptions. So you see that the argumentation framework naturally is a bit more complicated. Here we picked some arguments, and you see that, for instance, that we have three preferred and stable extensions, this one, and that one. I will come back to this example later on. Here is another example. Here now we are using the modal logic S4. So we are using modal operators. The attack rules is direct defeat, and again we have 4 stable and preferred extensions, which are these those that are marked by the green background. Again, I will come back to this example later on. And here is a more specific example, which was formed by Hoti and called the Asparagus Example. So suppose that we have a meal denoted by M. So usually when meal is served, one should not eat with fingers. So this is denoted by the propositional constant, propositional for atom F. However, if a meal is asparagus A, one should eat with finger. Okay, so one way of representing this situation, this scenario, is by using standard deontic logic, the STL, which is actually the normal modal logic KD, where the modal operator O intuitively represent obligations. This is one way of representing the situation. So we have a meal, asparagus, and the two obligations. What should be the attack rule in this case? So this situation corresponds to it's actually a paradigmatic case of specificity. A more specific obligation cancels or override less specific obligation. So if we know that the meal is served, asparagus is served, this is a more specific situation than knowing that we only have a meal. And here is one option of representing attacks based on specificity. So here, just briefly, I will briefly mention that here the attacker is considered, according to the conditions, more specific than the attacked argument. So in this case, we would like to eliminate the attacked argument. And so this in fact raises again the question how we should make inferences by having these such cases. And in this case, of course, we would like to infer that we would like to eat with, one can eat with fingers, although the situation is contradictory. Okay, because this formula represents a more specific situation than that formula. So again, we define the notion of entailments that are induced by sequence-based argumentation. So suppose that we have, again, a sequence-based argumentation consisting of arguments based on a specific logic, set of attack rules, and a set of assumptions S. And again, we denote by SEM the set of extensions of a specific type from this argumentation framework. So now note that we have actually three types of entailment relations, two types of skeptical entailments, and one type of credulous entailment. So one type of skeptical entailments means that psi follows from S if there is an argument in the intersection of all the extensions of the same types whose conclusion is psi. Okay, and we have a weaker notions of credulous of skeptical entailment. So psi weakly follows from S according to skeptical entailment if in every semantic, every extension of the semantics, we have an argument which need not be the same argument. So for every extension, we have some argument whose conclusion is psi. So in the first case, we require that we will have the same argument in all the extensions, and here we may have different arguments with different supports, but with the same conclusion. And according to credulous semantics, we just replace the intersection with the union. So psi follows from S according to the this kind of entailment, according to the credulous entailments, if there is an argument in some extensions whose conclusion is psi. So here is an example, again using the very simple argumentation framework, sequence-based argumentation framework that I have presented previously. So for instance, if we take the grounded extensions consisting of the sequence with the green background. So in this case, we see that if we use undercut, for instance, as classical logic, then we can infer according to all three types of entailment, of course, every tautology, and also we can infer Q in this case, again, because Q intuitively is not related to the contradiction in our assumption, while we cannot infer according to the grounded extension P, and we cannot infer not P, because again the conditions of the entailment relations are not satisfied. And in going back to the Asparagus dilemma, we see here that if we use the representation of this dilemma by S and use SDL as the base logic and specificity undercut as the attack rule, then according to all the base semantics that we have described previously and the three types of entailment relations, we are able to infer that that it is allowed to eat with fingers, and we cannot infer the converse. Okay, so by their definition, it is quite obvious that to see that skeptical semantics implies weakly skeptical semantics. Sorry, skeptical entailment implies weakly skeptical entailment, and this in turn implies credulous entailment. However, the converse is not true in both cases. Here is an example. Suppose that we have as our base set of assumptions P and Q and not P and Q. And we use classical logic as our base logic, and again, direct undercut as the sole attack rule. So in this case, for instance, it's not difficult to see that the preferred extensions and the stables extensions are either the arguments that classically follows from P and Q, or the arguments that classically follows from not P and Q. So in this case, by the skeptical, the regular skeptical entailments, we cannot infer Q because there is no, we don't have the same argument in all the extensions whose conclusion is Q. However, we are able to infer Q in this case from S because we have different arguments in each extension whose supports are, whose conclusions are Q. So they have different supports but the same conclusion. Therefore, we are able to infer Q in this case. So Q weakly follows from S according to skeptical semantics, but it doesn't follow from skeptical semantics from S. The properties of this entailment relation will be discussed later on. Okay, so far for the general description of sequence-based argumentation. So now let's go to some representation consideration, and we will start with some descriptions of possible extensions of the expressive power of the formalism. So there are several ways of making logical argumentation even more expressive. We shall discuss three types of extensions. First of all, I will distinguish between two types of assumptions: strict assumption and defeasible assumption. Another extension is by adding priorities to the argumentation framework. And the last extensions, again, concerning the expressive power, will be related to trading sequence with the more general notion of hypersequence. So let's start with the strict and defeasible assumption. In many cases, as Christian will describe in the second session, it is usual to divide the assumption to two types: strict assumptions, which are not attacked, we will denote them by X, and defeasible ones, which can be attacked, and we'll denote this assumption by S. In order to represent these two kinds of assumptions, we have to modify a little bit the attack rules. So the idea here are some descriptions of attack rules, and the idea is now the conditions of the attack should not be related to strict assumptions. So for the conditions, we only allow defeasible assumptions. So for instance, in the undercut rule, we see that the subset of the attacked support should not intersect with the strict assumption. So we only for the undercut, we only consider the supports of the attacked argument, which are the feasible ones and not the strict one. And similarly for the direct undercut, consistencies undercut, and so forth. We just have to make some modification in the side conditions of the rules, of the attack rules. So, for instance, recall the one of the examples that I presented previously, the one which is based on S4 as the model logic, and here we have the support the knowledge base. Suppose now that P is a strict rule. So previously we assumed that all the assumptions are defeasible. Now we can modify the framework such that P is strict rule, strict assumption, and the other assumptions are the feasible one. And so we replace direct defeat by the modified version incorporating strict assumptions. And in this case, you see, according to the red arrows, that some attacks are not valid anymore because, for instance, A8 cannot attack A1 because the attack is based on P, and B is now a strict assumption. So if you use this extension, the argumentation framework is adjusted or modified accordingly, so we do not have the red arrows anymore. So the attacks of A8 are removed. As a consequence, in this case, for instance, A1 is, for instance, in the grounded extension of the sequence-based argumentation, while it was not part of the grounded extension of that framework previously. Okay, another possibility of adding, of extending the language is by adding priorities. Again, this is very common in the context of structured argumentations. So the idea is that numerical information may be attached to defeasible assertions for reflecting preferences or relative confidence factor or whatsoever. So we denote by pi psi the priority, the relative priority of psi, where lower values, in our case, intuitively indicate higher priority. And by this, we can extend preferences between formula to preferences among arguments. Here are some ways of doing this. So suppose we have A1 with a support gamma 1 and A2 with a support gamma 2. So we can say, for instance, that A1 is preferred as at least as preferred as A2 by applying one of these considerations in those bullets. For instance, the second bullet represents weakest link principles, according to which we take the least preferred formula in the supports of A1 and A2 and compare them. And if the least preferred formula of A1 is still preferred than that of A2, then we say that A1 is preferred to A2. And we can apply different functions in this case. And in the last bullet, for instance, we apply Brefka preference subtheories order, according to which we make a stratification on the support of each argument according to the priorities that each formula has. So each strata consists of the support formula of the same priority. So now A1 is preferred to A2 if the first I strata are the same in A1 and in the support of A1 and A2, and the I plus 1 stratum of A1 strictly contains the I plus 1 stratum of A2. In this case, we say that A1 is preferred according to the stratification condition to A2. And now what we have to do is to take, of course, the preferences into considerations in the attack rules. So what we do here is we replace attack, the notion of attack, by defeat. So A1 defeats A2 if if A1 attacks A2, and secondly, if A2 is not strictly preferred to A1. And accordingly, we can define prioritized sequence-based argumentation frameworks in this case as well. So the only thing that we have to do now is to replace the notion of attack by the notion of defeat, and by this incorporate also the preferences. The rest remains actually the same. So Dong semantics is just as before. Here is an example. Again, one of the examples that I considered previously, using undercut as the attack rule and classical logic as the underlying base logic. So this is the part of the argumentation framework without priorities. Suppose now we have priority functions that according to which P is the most preferred formula, Q is in the middle, and not P or not Q is the least preferred formula. And suppose that we use the stratification-based criteria. So according to this comparison, we see that the attacks that are marked by the red arrows are no longer defeats. For instance, A7 attacks A8, but it doesn't defeat at A8 because, as you can see, the difference between the support of A7 and A8 is that, well, they have one similar formula, support formula, and the other formula of A8 is strictly preferred to the other formula of A7, so A7 cannot attack anymore A8. So we have to remove all the red arrows and again have a different framework. And in this case, for instance, A1 and A2 belong to the grounded semantics, but while they were not part of the grounded semantics in the non-stratified, non-preferred case. Okay, the last extension that I want to consider here is extending sequence to hypersequence. So here is the motivation. For some basic logic include the well-known modal logic S5, the relevance logic RM, Gödel logic LC. Some of these logic and some other logic do not have cut-free sequence calculi, or at least cut-free sequence calculi are not known for them, which means that the cut rule is essential for derivations in those logics. This means that for constructing counter arguments of an argument, it might not be enough to consider only the sub-formula of the arguments, but we might need extra formulas. As you see here in the cut rule, the blue formula is actually needed for the cut, and it is not a subset of the derived sequence. And so the search space, for instance, might be largely extended. by the need to use or to consider cut rules. So this is one of the reasons. We shall see later on some other reasons. This is one of the reasons for introducing hypersequence. So the logic that I have mentioned earlier do have cut-free hypersequence calculi, and hypersequence is in fact a finite multi-set of sequence. So instead of one sequence at a time for an argument, now we consider a multi-set of sequence, and this is an argument according to the hypersequential systems. Okay, and the intuition behind the hypersequence is that the different sequences are disjunctive. So this is a kind of disjunction of the sequence. Okay, and arguments now are hypersequence instead of just sequence. Of course, this is a generalization because a sequence is in particular a hypersequence. How we derive our hypersequence with the hypersequence calculi? So we have to adjust the inference rules. In many cases, we just have to adapt the logical sequence-based rules by adding further sequence to the hypersequence. So you see the red part of this rule is just the inference rule that is related to the sequence, and we can adapt it to hypersequence by adding side sequence to the rules. And of course, we also have to add structural rules, like, for instance, external weakening that allows us to add further more sequence to a derived hypersequence, or a splitting rules, which allows us to split a sequence to several sequence in a hypersequence. And by this, for instance, we get sequence calculi, hypersequence calculi like the following one. So this is, for instance, a hypersequential variation of LK that I've described previously, where again we have extended the logical rules and corresponding structural rules. For instance, you see here that we have external contractions that allows us to eliminate duplications in the hypersequence, internal contractions that allows us to eliminate duplications within a sequence. Similarly, external weakening that allows us to add sequence to a derived hypersequence. Internal weakening that, again, this is actually the allows us to apply the weakening rule for on a specific sequence in the hypersequence, etc. So by this, okay, so by this we are able to produce or construct hypersequence for simple sequence, and similarly we need to adjust the elimination rules. So we have a variation that is suitable for hypersequence for every sequence-based elimination rules. So we now have the underlying age, the subscript age that denotes the hypersequential version of the elimination rule. And you see that basically we just have to adjust the condition to hypersequence instead of sequence. And again, we get, in a very natural way, hypersequential based argumentation framework, where now the only change is that we trade arguments with hypersequence instead of sequence, and the attack rules are adjusted to hypersequence-based attack rules. Okay, so if we again come back to our previous example and we use the hypersequence versions of the attack rules, so now we see that, for instance, by applying the splitting rule on the standard sequence, which remains, as I said before, hypersequence, we now get new hypersequence like age 10, age 11, and age 12. And accordingly, you see that we get a little bit more complicated hypersequence argumentation framework. Here you see that the dashed circle and the dashed line are actually the sequence-based argumentation framework, and the solid lines and circles are the additions according to the hypersequence extensions. So you see here that, of course, in order to move to hypersequence, one of the drawbacks, so-called, is that, of course, the argumentation framework becomes more complicated. However, we have two main advantages. One is that, as I said previously, we can use, in many cases, cut-free hypersequence calculi. And the other advantage is that some limitation of sequence-based argumentation can be avoided, sometimes avoided, by moving to hypersequence. For instance, if we use the sequence-based argumentation, note that we have, in this case, one inconsistent preferred or stable extension consisting of the red nodes. So this extension is not consistent. The main, however, when we switch to hypersequence calculi or hypersequence argumentation framework, this extension is not admissible anymore. Because, for instance, you see that A2 is not defended from the attack of the hypersequence age 10. So, in order to make it admissible, we have to add an attacker of age 10, and by this we get again, okay, we had the attacker age 12 and A7 attackers of age 10, and by this we do get an admissible extension which is actually consistent, and this is not a coincidence. So one of the advantages in some cases of switching to hypersequential argumentation framework is that we can guarantee the consistency of extensions, something that we could not guarantee when we were on the sequence-based level. Okay, so far for representation considerations that are related to the extended expressive power. Now let's turn to some considerations that are related to consistency and minimality, something that I have mentioned previously. So recall that we argued that support, minimality, and consistency may be waived from the definition of arguments, and I've already mentioned some reasons that it is not realistic, for instance, that some computational complexity, unnecessarily computational considerations are involved, and so forth. And I also mentioned the practicalities that minimally and consistency can be taken care of at the level of the argumentation frameworks themselves by specifying appropriate attack rules and or using suitable logic. And I will demonstrate this in the next slides. So the first slides refers to consistency. And the claim is that argument with inconsistent support may not be filtered out, even in cases that the base logic is trivialized in the presence of inconsistency. So even if we have a logic that is not power consistent, we still not need to require that the support set will be consistent. Instead, inconsistency may be tolerated by appropriate attack rules of the argumentation framework. And the result that shows this is the following. So suppose that we have on one hand standard sequence-based argumentation in our sense, which is based on S, some logic L, and a set of attack rules that exclude attacks on tautological arguments. And we also suppose that the attack rules contains, the set of attack rules contains consistency undercut, and recall that consistency undercut indicates that an argument can be attacked when some of its support is not consistent. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, suppose that we have a framework in which consistency is enforced. So AF-con is a sequence-based argumentation for S, where the arguments are only those where the supports are consistent. And in this case, we remove the consistency undercut attack rule from the set of attack rules. So what the proposition shows is that, in fact, both frameworks have the same extensions with respect to all the base semantics, the base dunk semantics, which means in some sense that they are equivalent. So we do not really need the requirements of consistency once we make sure that we have appropriate attack rules that take care of this restriction. So in fact, there is a more general proposition that we have shown, that we have presented in the COMA conference, the last COMA conference, but this is, I think, enough to demonstrate the main principle that we do not really need the consistency assumption as part of the definition of argument. Now, concerning minimality, we have a similar result. So again, suppose that we have an argumentation framework consisting of general sequence without the minimality requirements, and normal attack rules. Well, normality basically means very natural conditions that are satisfied by all the attack rules, all the support-based attack rules that I've described previously. So they basically mean, normality means that the attack rules are closed under stronger attacking arguments, and they are closed under weaker attacked argument. So if the attacked argument is weakened, the attack still holds. So again, suppose that on one hand we have standard sequence-based argumentation, and on the other hand we have an argumentation framework where the arguments, the support of the argument are minimized with respect to the subset relation. Then what this proposition says is that every extension of the minimized argumentation framework can be viewed or associated with a minimization of a corresponding extension of the regular argumentation framework. So again, minimality, the minimality condition is not always needed. Okay, this involves some alternative formalizations of the attack rules, and I will consider this in the last part of the representation consideration part of this talk. So, as I said, the handling of the inconsistency and minimality in logical argumentation framework may be shifted for arguments to attack rules. However, the use of attack rules should be taken with care, especially where the base logic is non-classical. So we have to be very careful about the formalization of the attack rules when we define the corresponding framework, which, especially when it is not based on classical logic. Here is an example. So recall the defeat rule. And here is again the original definition of defeat. So the green argument is the attacker, the red one is the attacked argument, and the blue condition is actually the condition of the for applying this rule. So this means that in fact, if the conclusion of the attack rule implies the negation of some subset of the support of the attacked argument, then we can apply the rule of defeats. So, for instance, in classical logic, this is one of the reasons that not P implies not P can attack P implies P. And again, the intuition here is that P, not P, are contradictory. But this is not always the case in all the logics. For instance, if we consider LFIs, the logic of formal inconsistency, where they introduce the new connective circle, which intuitively means that circle C means that C is consistent. So in this case, if we assume P and not P, we cannot infer circle P, which means that from P and not P, we cannot infer anything, everything, okay? So P and not P, unlike classical logic, in LFI, not every formula is inferable from this contradictory, classically contradictory set of assumptions. So when LFI is the base logic, we don't want that P implies not P will attack P implies P. So what we do want, for instance, is that P implies not P implies not P will attack P circle P implies P, because now the conclusion of the attacking rule and the attacking argument indeed contradicts the support of the attacked argument, because indeed we cannot assume that we have P and we have not P, and moreover P is consistent. This is of course an inconsistent set also in the context of LFI. So what we could do is to change a little bit the rule of defeat, so that one option is to require that the conclusion of the attacking argument and some support of the attacked argument are not consistent according to the base logic. And this will solve the problem, the original problem of defeat. There are some alternatives, of course, for defeat, which are suitable for LFI. So there are several variations of this rule. For instance, we can specify that we want attacks that are based on the consistency assumption of the attacker. So according to this intuition, we want that an argument which is based on P and circle P and whose conclusion is P, this argument should attack not P implies not P, because again, the assumption of the attacking argument is that P is consistent. However, this should not be so we don't want the converse. So P implies not P, according to this intuition, should not attack circle P, P implies P. So the formalization of the rule of the defeat rule according to this intuition is that we use the original condition of the defeat and we add a new condition which actually specifies that the support of the attacking rule is actually consistent. So it implies the circle of the conjunction of the support. Similarly, we can have another variation which is based on the consistency of the conclusion of the attacker. So in this case, we just have to add to the original condition a new condition that says that the conclusion of the attacker is consistent, and a third variation is that is based on the consistency assumption of the attacked argument. And again, this involves another condition to the standard condition of the original rule. So this brings me to the next note that says that minimality should not always be enforced. And the reason is, in this case, that, for instance, according to the first alternative of defeat, recall that this was the first alternative. So in this case, for instance, circle P is not necessary for supporting P in the argument circle P, P implies P. So it's enough to assume P in order to conclude P. We don't need circle P. However, circle P is needed for applying the attack according to this according to alternative one of defeat. So if we had minimality, we wouldn't be able to apply the defeat rule. So it's only because we do not require minimality so that now we can apply rules like this variation of the defeat. So minimality should not always be enforced. Okay, and this brings me to the last part of the first sessions, which is about some considerations about the reasoning process of sequence-based argumentation. And here I will consider some rationality postulates and a few words about relations to reasoning with maximal consistency. Okay, so reasoning with logical argumentation is usually considered from several perspectives. One very common perspective, especially in belief revision or in argumentation theory, is a postulate-based approach, which is again based on some properties that should or are satisfied or violated by the extensions or by the entailment relations of the underlying logical argumentation framework. Another perspective of reasoning is related to computational aspects. And here we will consider how we will describe how we are able to compute consequences of argumentation framework by dynamic derivation. And the last aspect is a relation of the reasoning process of logical argumentation framework with other forms of non-monotonic reasoning, like default logic, reasoning maximal consistency, and so forth. So concerning the first issue, postulate-based approach, I will highlight some results in the next slides. Some other results will be presented in the KR presentation on Monday. So mainly some characterization of the entailment relations and the postulates that are satisfied by them. The computational aspect, and mainly those that are related to dynamic derivation, will be covered in the next session. And relation to other forms of non-monotonic reasoning will also be covered on the next session. I will cover only the relations to, in this session, I will cover only the relations to reasoning with maximally consistent subsets. So, okay, let's start with the rationality postulates. So one of the motivations for considering those postulates is that, as you have seen, logical argumentation frameworks are affected by a variety of factors or considerations. For instance, what language to use, or what logic to use, what inference mechanism to use, what should be the type of attacks. And I mentioned some consideration earlier. And how to choose the semantics, what extensions to consider. And so there are many considerations that are involved in the constructions or the definition of argumentation frameworks. And the question, of course, that one of the questions that is raised is how to choose an optimal or useful argumentation framework for specific needs. And postulate-based method can partially help us to reach some ideas or insights on how to construct argumentation frameworks in terms of some of the desiderata lists. So the postulates that I will consider are roughly divided to two kinds. Those that are referred to extensions, to individual extensions, useful mainly for credulous reasoning, and those that are refer to set of extensions, which again they will be useful mainly for skeptical reasoning. And to see some motivation behind those postulates, consider once again the examples that I've shown earlier, which again is based on classical logic, direct defeat, and consistency undercut, together with this set of assumptions, the S. And this is part of the argumentation framework. And again, we have several extensions, preferred and stable extensions in this case. Note that if we change direct defeat to defeat, some of the arrows, we have new attacks. Okay, so you see that the red arrows are those that not the same as the arrows that we had in the direct defeat case. Okay, so when we had direct defeats, we had these arrows. Some of them become double arrow, and some of them just appear in the case of the defeat. And so when we switch to defeat, we have one more preferred and stable extension, which is not consistent. So you see here that choosing the appropriate attack rule has some far-reaching consequences on the properties of the extensions. So when we use direct defeat, we could assure, according to the propositions that I will show soon, we could assure the consistency of the extension. But when we switch to defeat instead of direct defeat, consistency cannot be assured anymore in this case. Okay, so this extension is not consistent. So here are some rationality postulates, common rationality postulates. Most of them were introduced by Caminada and Jude in their paper from 2007 in the Artificial Intelligence Journal, but there are some other postulates. So we have several postulates. Some of them are related to closure properties of the extensions. So for instance, that the conclusions of extensions will be closed under the transitive closure of the logic. So the extension will, the E will contain also the transitive closure of its conclusion. Similar property concerning the support, closures under support, closure are under sub-arguments, and you see here in the footnote the exact definition. So the sub-argument is just an argument with which has a subset of the support of the original argument. Some consistency postulates concerning conclusion consistency, support consistency, maximal consistency, and other postulates concerning associativeness, strong associativeness, support inclusion, etc. So these postulates are discussed in the literature, and I will not repeat their motivation here. And we want to examine in what cases these postulates can be assured, can be verified. So for this, for our study, we assume that the logics of the framework meet some very restricted requirements. So we assume that the following core rules holds in all the logic that we will consider: reflexivity, cut, the two kinds of monotonicity, and negation, and the rules, the logical rules concerning negation in the right and the left, and conjunction in the right of the left. This is the only assumptions about the logic that we make. So these rules are admissible according to the logic. And we divide the framework to three types according to the nature of the attack rules. So one family of frameworks consists of attack rules that based on the support of the attack of the arguments. So the subsets, arguments that are based on subsets of attacks. So the attack rule should contain defeat and undercut. The other kind or other family of framework consists of attack rules with direct attacks. So here we assume that the set of attack rules is a subset of direct defeat and direct undercut. And the last family consists of the direct attack together with consistency undercut. And here you see some of our results. So this table shows what postulate is satisfied in what case. So you see here again in the left, most left column, we see the postulates, and the table is divided to the 3 types of framework that I just defined. And in each cell, you see whether the framework, the postulate is satisfied by the framework under what condition about the semantics. For instance, closure of extensions is always satisfied with respect to all the semantics whenever we use direct attacks or consistency-based attacks, but it is not assured, as I've shown previously, when we use subset-based attacks. And in general, you see here that in most of the cases, when we use direct-based attack, we can assure most, if not all, the postulates with respect to most of the semantics, while when we use subset-based attack, the situation is more, let's say, complicated. Not all the properties can be assured always. Another kind of postulates-based study is related to the properties of the entailment relation. And here we have studied our relations that are induced by logical framework with respect to the general patterns of non-monotonic reasoning. These are very common patterns specified by the KLM, Krauss, Lehmann, Megidor, and by some other researchers like Dov Gabay and David Mackinsons, and they actually divided, or Yoav Sham, yes, and they actually divided the family of entailment relation to different families. Cumulative entailment relations that satisfy these properties: cautious reflexivity, right weakening, left logical equivalence, cautious monotonicity, and cautious cut. So some cautious versions of basic property of the entailment relations. Preferential entailments are cumulative entailments which also satisfy the OR postulates. And rational entailments are preferential that also satisfy rational monotonicity. And again, we have some results, but before I show these results, just recall that we have 3 types of entailment relations: 2 skeptical ones and 1 credulous entailment. And recall that we have divided the frameworks to 3 classes according to the attack relations. And here are some results concerning the different properties of the entailment relations that are induced by the different frameworks. So, for instance, you see here that the skeptical entailments, both the weak skeptical entailment and the regular skeptical entailments, are cumulative with respect, for instance, with respect to the consistency and the direct families, while none of them is rational with respect to set-based attack or consistency-based attack. It is interesting to note that when we use credulous entailments, so we get in many cases actually a monotonic entailment. So if you look at the cell on the bottom right part of the table, you see that monotonicity is preserved, is satisfied by credulous entailments in many cases. Okay, final remarks about relations to reasoning with maximal consistency. maximal consistency, reasoning with maximal consistency is a very common approach in non-monotonic reasoning. And so the idea is, once we have a set of assumptions, which is not always classically consistent or consistent in general, to consider the maximal consistent subsets of the set and to make inferences according to the maximally consistent subset of the set. So again, once we consider the maximally consistent sets of a given set of assumptions, we have two kinds of entailments and two forms of entailments, of skeptical entailments and one credulous one. So we have the skeptical entailments are the following: psi follows from C if it is in the transitive closure of the intersection of the maximally consistent subset of S. It weakly follows, according to the skeptical reasoning, from S if it is in the intersection of the transitive closures of the sets in the maximally consistent subsets. So ordinary so-called skeptical entailments, according to ordinary skeptical entailments, we first take the intersection and then the transitive closure. And according to the weak version, we first take the transitive closure of the subsets and then take the intersection. And of course, we have one credulous version, according to which we just consider the union of the transitive closures of the maximally consistent subset. Again, it is easy to see that skeptical entailments implies the weak skeptical entailments, and this in turn implies the credulous entailment. However, the converse is not true, as we shall see shortly. So according to, so for here is an example, we have P, not P and Q. We have two maximally consistent subsets according to classical logic, PQ and not PQ, and obviously we can infer here Q according to both skeptical way of reasoning, but of course P is not inferable according to the maximally consistent subset, and neither not P is inferable according to the maximally consistent subset, because neither of them is in the intersection of the maximally consistent subsets. However, there is a difference between the two types of skeptical reasoning, which can be demonstrated here. So if we consider S2, P and Q and not P and Q, so in this case we have two, again, we have two maximally consistent subsets of S2, PQ and not P and Q. So their intersection is now empty. According to the skeptical reasoning, we only can infer classical tautologies from S2, while according to the weak skeptical reasoning, we can infer Q from S2 because, again, Q is in the transitive closure of each maximally consistent subset, and therefore it is in their intersection. So according to the weak version of the credulous skeptical reasoning, we can infer everything that is based on Q, while we cannot do so according to skeptical standard skeptical reasoning. So the relation between reasoning with maximally consistent subset and argumentation theory has been identified in the literature. Here are some examples for this. And we have a theorem showing that, in fact, for instance, if you use classical logic and direct undercut, then there is a correspondence and actually equivalence then between reasoning with maximally consistent subset and reasoning with Dung semantics. So you see that in all the cases, skeptical, weakly skeptical, and credulous entailments, we actually have the same conclusions if we use maximally consistent subset and if we use preferred or stable-based reasoning. Again, in this case, when classical logic is used and when direct undercut is the sole attack rule. Similarly, if we use, for instance, undercut and defeat, we have similar results concerning skeptical and credulous entailments. And if you want also to apply this propositional theorem to weakly skeptical entailments, then we have to change a little bit the forms of the arguments, and then we could also get the same result with respect to maximally consistent subset. We also have some other results that relate reasoning with argumentation framework to other forms of reasoning with consistency, consistent subsets. For instance, here you see that, for instance, if we consider S3, you see that, in fact, in both, if we take the intersection of the maximally consistent subset and if we take the intersection of the transitive closures of the consistent subset, both intersections are empty. So according to the skeptical and weakly skeptical entailments, we can only infer tautological conclusions. However, in this case, we might want to consider also conclusions that are related to Q, because you see here that Q is not really related to the inconsistency of S3. This led Befferhat, Dubois, and Pratt to consider a variation of entailments based on a consistent subset that need not be maximal. And again, we have a theorem that shows that if we use consistency undercut and defeating rebuttal as our attack rules, then we can actually imitate reasoning with consistency subset and not necessarily maximally consistent subset. And again, the theorem shows that if we use classical logic together with defeating rebuttal and consistency undercut, then actually reasoning with the entailment according to Befferhat, Pratt, and Dubois coincide with reasoning with argumentation, sequence-based argumentation according to the grounded, preferred, or the stable semantics. So this was just a sketch of some of the results that are related to reasoning with maximal consistency and argumentation frameworks. There are some other results that relate argumentation framework or sequence-based argumentation framework with reasoning with maximal consistency. They appear in these two survey papers. And there are other results, of course, that have that highlight some other aspect of the relations between argumentation framework to reasoning with maximal consistency. Some of the papers are listed here. Okay, that concludes the first session.
Okay, so my part now will be about two things, namely the first part, and the two things are rather disconnected in a sense. So even if you skip the first part, you could join in the second part without a problem. So the first part will be about dynamic derivations. So while Ofer was talking about using sequence as arguments and using some kind of sequent rules, elimination rules, in order to model argumentative attacks, and then we use dung semantics in order to select arguments. What I will now be focusing on is more the reasoning process. So having a step-by-step procedure which models the reasoning process, which we have when we have a certain set of information which may be conflicting, and then we want to derive defeasibly conclusions from it in a step-by-step way. So a dynamic proof procedure, it's different than the usual proof procedures you may be used to, in the sense that it has a non-monotonic flavor. So sometimes some conclusions will be derived at some point in the procedure, but will be revised later on. So this makes this derivations dynamic. And the second part of the talk will then be here the bigger picture. I will try to relate logical argumentation to the more general landscape of non-monotonic logic. I will try to see how does this fit in, how does it compare to other approaches, and how have scholars been approaching the topic of comparing these approaches, like can certain approaches be translated into other approaches. So I will highlight some results in this section and try to categorize a little bit this rather colorful zoo of non-monotonic logic. Okay. Good, but let's begin with the dynamic derivations. So this will be structured in the following way. So the basic question is always, so how to define proofs in a non-monotonic setting. So in a setting where we have arguments, but also counter-arguments, also argumentative defeat. The idea is, just like in any proof system, to apply inference rules. But in addition to the inference rules, as you may remember from Ofer's part of the talk, we also introduce in logical argumentation, we also introduce elimination rules, which will model the defeat. So applying simply rules will lead me to a notion which we call simple derivation. A simple derivation is simply a set of lines, a linear structure where basically proof rules have been applied, but including also elimination rules. But then, of course, as elimination rules have the intuition that certain arguments should be defeated, at each step of the proof, we have to ask ourselves, what does now count really as derived and what doesn't count as derived? Now, a simple idea would be to simply say, if an argument or a sequence has been eliminated by a rule, then it shouldn't count as derived or as accepted. However, there is this phenomenon that sometimes arguments can get reinstated. So you have a defense. You remember the dung semantics, the defense is a very central notion to them. Admissibility was the technical term there. So we have to take care of this phenomenon. And for this, we will define an evaluation procedure, which for each state of the proof outputs us what at this stage of the proof should be considered as acceptable and what should be considered as eliminated. And this will lead to a certain dynamics, because as the proof proceeds, at each stage of the proof, certain sequence may be acceptable and later on not, and vice versa. So this leads to a different notion of derivation, which we call the dynamic derivation. Also, when moving to dynamic derivations, we have to be a bit careful about certain phenomena which concern the coherence of what we call accepted and what we call eliminated. So it should never happen, for instance, that one and the same argument is at the same time considered eliminated, so inactive, but also at the very same time acts as an active attacker of another argument. So causes the elimination of another argument. That should never be the case. That would be a sign of incoherence. So we have to take care of this. And this will be also integrated in this notion of dynamic derivation. And then when we have dynamic derivations, there's still the question. So at that moment, we will have for each stage of the proof a notion of what is acceptable at that very stage of the proof. But sometimes, as I said already, there's this dynamic. So if we move on with the proof, things may change again. So we need some kind of criteria which determine what should count and when should something count as finally derived, as finally acceptable. So when should something be defeasibly entailed by the given information? And that is the notion of final derivability. A similar notion has been developed in the context of adaptive logics, where also dynamic proofs have been presented, not in a sequence style and not in an argumentative setting, but in a Hilbert style setting. And many of the things I say about dynamic proofs and sequence style argumentation resemble somewhat dynamic derivations in adaptive logics, but it's also quite different because the underlying idea is always to have this very explicit representation of argumentative attacks. Okay, so let's move to the first point. This was simple derivations. So how do simple derivations work? It's very simple. That's why the name is simple derivations, because what we do there is simply apply inference rules, but also apply elimination rules. So I always start on the background of an argumentative setting. An argumentative setting, if you don't remember from the first part of our tutorial, was you have a formal logic. A formal logic comes with a formal language and a derivability relation. You have a calculus which is adequate to this logic, so a sequent calculus which is adequate to this logic. That means it's sound and complete with respect to the derivability relation of the given logic. And you have a set A of attack rules, so of elimination rules. These are also inference rules, but they have this funny output that a sequent which is the conclusion of that rule is eliminated. You will see examples just in a second, but you saw many examples in the first part of the proof of the tutorial. And now, of course, we always have a given set of information from which we want to derive new information. And this set is in the rest of the tutorial always denoted by S. So S is a set of formulas in the language of our logic L. Okay, so that's the background, and the inference rules, the positive inference rules, not the elimination rules, come from the calculus, and the elimination rules come from this set A of elimination rules. Okay, so let's, most of the examples I will present here are always based on this setting here. Classical logic is our logic. The sequent calculus LK is our calculus, our base calculus, and we work with one elimination rule, the undercut, which you saw on Ofer's slide, but I have it on the next slide just to make you remember it. Now, for the first example, my set of information will be simply P, not P, and Q. So what you expect to derive here is Q, but not P, and not P, because there you have the conflict. Okay, so let's look at the notion of a simple derivation. So it's based on introduction rules, which come from our calculus. So these introduction rules, they always look like this here. This is our rule R. It comes with certain conditions here in orange. There may be an argument 1 to argument n. There may be also no argument. So for instance, if you have an axiom, this is a rule which has no prerequisite. So this is an extreme case of such a rule. And then these rules from the calculus allow us to introduce what we call proof tuples. So proof tuples have 4 arguments, namely first the line number, second the sequent which is introduced, and third a justification, fourth what is currently the empty set for introducing tuples, but this will play a role for when I talk about elimination rules. Here we will track the attacker of a certain sequence. So this has no consequence here when we talk about introducing tuples, because this has nothing to do with argumentative attacks. So the rule is always from our calculus, and of course the conditions, what we call upon, the sequence have to be derived already within our derivation. So there have to be tuples which correspond to the conditions of the rule. For each and every member of the condition, we have to have it already somewhere in the proof above. The justification will simply make a call upon the rule and call upon the line numbers in which the conditions have been derived. So here is a simple example. I start the proof here simply with an axiom. P implies P. There I clearly don't have to call upon a previous condition, because it's this rule here which doesn't have a prerequisite. Next step, I apply a rule from the calculus, the negation right rule from LK, and I produce a new argument, call upon line number 1 in the justification. So you see here in the actual proof, I don't write the brackets here for the tuples, so it's just to simplify the notation to produce less clutter, and so on and so forth. So this is introducing tuples. The next step is to infuse some diffusibility into the proof system. So let's talk now about elimination rules. So this is really where we differ now from standard proofs in LK. So we have this linearized version of standard rules in LK so far, but now come the new rules, the attack rules. So let's say we have this proof by now. So if we have introduced 4 or 5 different arguments, 5 different sequences simply by LK rules. And now what we do is we apply, and y is, it's too small, sorry. We apply a elimination rule. Namely, the elimination rule here is the undercut rule. So the undercut rule looked like this. You have an attacking sequence, which as its conclusion expresses that a part of the support of the attacked sequence here on the right is false. So psi1 implies the falsity of the conjunction of a part of the support of the attacked sequence. And this should actually be, this is the specific part about undercut, the conclusion of the attacking sequence should be equivalent to the negation of a part of the support of the attacked sequence. So that's undercut. In defeat, you didn't have this equivalence here. You only had the first part, etc. There are different attack rules. It doesn't really matter what we choose. I chose this one for the example for no deeper reason. And so what the rule mentions here as a conclusion is a so-called elimination sequence. So this is simply expressing that this sequence at this point should not be considered acceptable. But I will say more about this at a later point because of reinstatement phenomena, so that certain sequence could be attacked, but the attackers could be attacked as well. So otherwise, the introduction of elimination sequence works very much the same way as the introduction of sequence themselves. We call upon a rule. The rule has to be a rule in our set of attack rules, of elimination rules. One slight constraint here, which we didn't see for the introduction rules, is the following. The attacker and the attacked argument should always be arguments based on the information which on which the proof is based, so on our S. So both of the support sets of the attacker and the attacked argument are subsets of our information set. And otherwise, the justification is just the same. We have to call upon conditions, which of course are already part of the proof. We cannot just invent them. So it's pretty much the same as before. And here you see an application of this undercut rule. So I use as an attacker the argument on line 5. I attack the argument on line 1. So line 1, the sequence on line 1 is here eliminated. I track here, this is the difference to the introduction rules. I track the attacking argument here in the 4th column of the proof. Okay, and here I just justify what I do. So this is how it looks like. And of course, I can also re-attack here. And this brings me immediately to my next point. So these re-attackings. So now the P implies P attacks, not P implies not P. And so at that moment, we have to ask ourselves, what should now count at this stage 9 of the proof? What should now count as accepted and what should now count as eliminated? Because as we can see, there is a line 5 and a line 9, and P, this P introducing tuple is eliminated, and also the not P introducing tuple is eliminated. And their attackers are exactly these two, just vice versa. So the question is, what should we do now? What should be counted as acceptable? And for that, we need to define some kind of evaluation procedure for a given stage of a proof. And that's what we will do now. So how do we do that? The basic idea is that we have a top-down procedure. So we are at a certain stage of a proof, at a certain line of the proof, and this algorithm now will scan through the proof from the last line to the first line, and will, by scanning step by step through the proof, will determine what counts as acceptable and what counts as eliminated. So here is the procedure. So we input to the procedure a certain simple derivation. Let's say our simple derivation at stage 9, at line 9. What the procedure first does is to initialize certain sets, actually the sets which it will output. So the first set will simply be used to keep track of the attacking sequence. The second set will be used to keep track of the eliminated sequence in this proof. And the fourth one simply will keep track of everything which has been derived in the proof. Now, being derived is simply a syntactical matter. It's just a question whether something has been derived by a certain inference rule. But we will see later on the notion of being acceptable is different from that one. Acceptable means having been derived, but also having not been eliminated. We come to that in a second. So now what the procedure does is, as I already mentioned, it works top down. So it looks at the top line of the proof. In our example, that would be line 9. It looks, what kind of tuple do I have here? Is it an introducing tuple or is it an eliminating tuple? So is it a tuple based on an inference rule from LK or is it based on an attacking rule? Now, if it is an introducing tuple, what the algorithm does is very simple. It just takes the sequence which has been derived and says, okay, add it to the set which of all the sequence which have been derived. It's more interesting in the case where it is an eliminating tuple. Now the algorithm has to decide whether the sequence which is attacked here, our S, should be counted as eliminated or not. And this question is simply decided by looking at whether the attacking sequence R is itself already eliminated at this point of the procedure or not. If it is already eliminated, then the idea is, well, then if it isn't eliminated, the idea is that we add the attacked sequence to the set of eliminated sequence. Why? Because the attacker is still active. It is not eliminated at this point of the proof. Hopefully also not later, otherwise we have a problem, but I will come to that. And the attacking sequence is moved to the set of attacking sequence. If the attacking sequence is eliminated, the idea is do nothing. This is an inactive attack. Okay, and then the procedure moves on to the next line of the proof. So from line 9 to line 8, etc., until we reach the last line of the proof. Then we determine what is accepted actually in this proof. And as I said, the idea is we look at all the derived sequence and we just subtract the eliminated sequence. Everything which has not been eliminated must be accepted. And so we return the set of attackers, the set of eliminated sequence, and the set of accepted sequence. So this procedure determines for each stage of the proof what is effectively eliminated, what is effectively accepted. Okay, so let's look at the example. So as I said, it's a top-down procedure. So we will start now with line 9. Here I keep track of the 3 sets which this procedure actually populates. So the eliminated sequence, the attacked sequence, and the derived sequence. So in the procedure at this stage, what we do first, we simply initialize our 3 sets with the empty set. Now we move on. We look at the last line. So we look at the top of our derivation and we check what is it? What kind of tuple is it? Is it an introducing tuple or is it an eliminating tuple? Now in this case, it's an eliminating tuple. So we are here in the else if. So the top is an eliminating tuple. The next thing we have to check is if the attacker, P implies P, is already eliminated. Obviously not, we didn't do anything so far. So what we do is we move the attacked sequence into the elimination set. So this one is now counted as being eliminated and the attacker is counted as an active attacker. It's moved to the attack set. Now we move on. The next step is simple. It's just an introducing tuple. So we just add the sequence which was produced here to the derived sequence, etc. Now we have an interesting point here at stage 6 because now we have again an eliminating tuple. However, the attacker here, not P implies not P, has been already eliminated, namely at line 9. So it was already featured here in the set elim, and therefore we don't have to do anything. And then we move on. We just add, these are all introducing tuples. We just add them to derived. And now we are finished. So we can produce our set of accepted sequence by looking at everything which has been derived and subtracting everything which has been eliminated. In this case, only this one here. So this one is not accepted. Everything else in derived is accepted. And we return that. That's how this procedure works. Okay. So if you have any questions, just interrupt me, please. So I now start talking about the first kind of problem which can occur. And that's the problem of incoherence. So it is one desiderata that we would never have a situation where one and the same argument is at the same time eliminated while also being an active attacker. Now, as you see that the algorithm somehow tries to take care of this already by having this claim here that, oh, if you have an attacker which is eliminated, it shouldn't count as an attack. However, this is not an entirely certain safeguard against this kind of situation. So I give you now an example that this kind of situation can still occur if one builds up the proof in not the right way. We have to then talk about how to build up the proof in the right way, so to avoid such situations. But here is how the situation can occur. For that, I use a rather non-standard logic, which doesn't allow for a double negation introduction, just to keep things very simple. But the situation can also occur in other logics like classical logic. It's just for the sake of demonstration that I use this. So here is my set of information. So it's P, not P, not P, not P, and four times not P. That's the set of information. Now what happens is the following. So now let's build a funny proof out of this strange information set. So I introduce now some arguments by means of axiom rule. And now I do my first elimination step. So as I have not P, I can attack not P. I can go on, introduce new arguments, and make another attack. Not P attacks P, etc. I can make another attack. 3 times not P attacks 2 times not P, etc., etc. Now, what happens? Now I'm at stage 9. Now let's look and see what happens at this very stage of the proof if we apply our evaluation procedure. And now you will see that exactly that happens what we didn't want to happen, namely the kind of incoherence that we get an argument which is at the same time eliminated as it is an active attacker. So if we start our procedure here, well, we have an eliminating tuple, so we add our attacker to the set of attackers and the eliminated sequence to the set of eliminated sequence. We go on here, we have just an introduction tuple. This one is inactive because the attacker was already eliminated in the stage before. So I write this here in gray. That means this doesn't happen. Next thing, introducing tuple? No, next thing, eliminating tuple. So we again do the same procedure. We check whether the attacker is already eliminated. It is not. So therefore the attack is active. Therefore we add this one to the attackers and the attacked one to the eliminated ones. We move on. We are now at stage 4 and now it happens what we didn't want to. Although we did everything correctly according to simple derivations and we applied our evaluation procedure correctly, but what happens here is, now you see this attacker here, not P, was not yet added to the eliminated tuples because the attack here at line 7 was inactivated because the attacker was itself already eliminated by the attack in line 9. So this one is still active. However, now what it does, it eliminates not P, but not P was at the previous stage. From the top-down perspective at a previous stage, it was already an active attacker, but here it now becomes eliminated. And that's, of course, a problem. That's a kind of incoherence which we actually wanted to avoid. So we have to take care, when we define derivations, we have to take care of the fact that we can build up proofs only in such a way that these kind of scenarios are avoided. So we call this a case of incoherence. So incoherence is if one and the same argument is eliminated and accepted at the same time. And an active attacker at the same time. So, okay. So question is now, how can we define simple derivations? How can we refine this definition of simple derivations in such a way that we can take care of such problems, that we can avoid such problems? So one thing we have to observe here is, okay, so the evaluation procedure works in a top-down manner. So it is somehow sensitive to the order in which attacks have been introduced, as you just saw with this example. So sometimes it may be necessary, in order to keep coherence, to introduce several attacks at the very same time. So like in this example, what we would like to do here at this stage, we would like to make sure that this attack here is not anymore active. So how can we do that? We can introduce several attacks at the same time. So if we introduce the attack at line 9 together with the attack at line 10, then we don't run into this problem of incoherence anymore. So here's just a demonstration. If I run through the proof, now as I build up my sets, the problem doesn't occur anymore, because what was the problem? Let's look back. The problem was that this one, not P, was at this stage, at stage 6, an attacker, an active attacker, and then it got eliminated at stage 4. So why is this avoided now? The reason is that here at stage 10, I made sure already to deactivate the attack which caused the problem at stage 6. So I eliminate this attacking sequence here already now, and do not wait for line 4 to do the job. So I need to make sure that certain attacks may have to reappear here when I introduce the attack at line 9. That means I have to allow for cases where I introduce several attacks at the very same time, and then only apply the evaluation procedure. Okay, so this works out if I do it in this way. So we have to change our definition of simple derivations slightly by allowing for introducing of several elimination tuples at the very same time, and then only apply the evaluation procedure. And that's what we will do now. Okay, so we now move from the notion of simple derivations to the notion of dynamic derivations, which is a kind of constrained way of building simple derivations being informed by the evaluation procedure. So, so here is the definition of a dynamic derivation. So it's an inductive definition. It starts with the base. The base case is simply that we introduce a certain sequence at stage 1. So it's always a simple derivation. So it's the same rules as before. I can have introduction rules, I have elimination rules, and I apply them. However, now the difference is the way it constrains simple derivation is the following way. So when we introduce now introducing tuples, then we have to do the following. So first of all, we are allowed to introduce several introducing tuples at the same time. And what we also want to do is that these introduced sequence, they should not be already eliminated when they are at the point when they are introduced. So we look at the evaluation of the procedure, and the newly introduced sequence should not be immediately eliminated. That will be kind of an irrational procedure that somebody introduces an argument which already is, by the given information, a bad argument. So we disallow for that. Similarly, for elimination tuples, we allow for several elimination tuples to be introduced at the same time. And now we have this additional constraint: the resulting derivation should be coherent. So there should be not an argument which is at the same time an attacker and eliminated. And similarly, as before, for the introducing tuples, we also don't want that one of the introduced attackers is already attacked by some accepted sequence in the derivation. That should also not happen. It would be a kind of irrationality problem if one would allow for that. Okay, so this is the way dynamic derivations proceed. Now, here on the left-hand side, you see an example how we go through the proof. Here, you also see immediately that if we would now, for instance, at stage 6, only introduce this eliminating sequence, then we would have a problem. Why? Because now at stage 6, we would have again the situation that we have an argument which is both eliminated and attacked. So we have to accompany the attack on stage 6 with a helping attack, namely this one on stage 7. So we have to introduce 2 lines at the very same time in order to avoid the coherence problem. And then it works out. then we have not a situation of incoherence. If we introduce both lines at the same time, and as we already saw, also line 9, we cannot introduce in an isolated way. It has to come with a helping line, which will establish the situation to be a coherent one. So, okay, dynamic derivations in a nutshell are simple derivations, but the way simple derivations are built up is somewhat constrained because, and this is the key, we have to take care of coherence. And how do we do that? We only apply the evaluation procedure after several eliminating tuples or several introducing tuples have been introduced. Okay, the next question is, okay, so as we can see here, the situation is highly dynamic. So at some point P was derived, at some point not P was derived, etc., etc. So proofs change all the time. The evaluation of proofs changes all the time. So the question is, what should and when should something be considered as finally derived in a proof? So when should we consider it as a defeasible entailment? And so for that, we again have to define certain criteria which determine when an argument in a proof is considered as statically or finally derived. And the idea is very simple. An argument at a certain stage of a proof is considered finally derived, just in case it is at that moment accepted, plus if we extend the proof in whatever way, the argument should not be eliminated. So there is no way anymore to eliminate the argument at that very point. And if this is satisfied, we call the argument finally derived. It should be, of course, an argument whose support is in the given information which we have available. So this is being finally derived in a derivation. Then we, of course, we can also say an argument is finally derivable from a certain set of information, in case we can produce a derivation such that in this derivation, the argument is finally derived. So if we can prove it such that it is finally derived in some way, then it's called finally derivable. Now, you may think, okay, this could cause a problem because maybe the question whether something is finally derivable really depends very much on the way I build up the proof. So if I build up the proof in the wrong way, maybe it could happen that I cannot finally derive something which in another way of building up the proof is finally derivable, but based on the same information. So in other words, it would be a desideratum to have some kind of invariance. So we want to make sure that an argument is finally derivable. If it is finally derivable, it can be finally derived from every kind of proof based on the same information. And I will come back later to this desideratum because it is actually fulfillable for a certain class of settings. Now, once one has this notion of final derivability, one can define a non-monotonic entailment relation. Namely, phi is non-monotonically entailed by a given information S if we can find an argument for it which is finally derivable from S. Okay, so it doesn't matter how the support looks like, but if we can find some argument for it, the support, of course, has to be part of the information which we have, then then it is considered to be entailed. Okay, so let's look how this plays out in our example proof from before. This is again the proof based on classical logic. So the question is, the first question is this one here on line 2, is this argument finally derived? And now what would you have to check? Is it accepted currently? And this is yes, there are no elimination tuples so far. But the real question here is, can the proof here be further extended in such a way that this sequent is eliminated? And if we look at the sequent, it has an empty support. So a sequent with an empty support cannot be attacked by the undercut attack. And this was the attack rule with which we worked here. So yes, this sequent is already finally derived in the proof. Next question, is this sequent here on line 3 finally derived? And now here we have to answer negatively. However, we see that it is currently accepted, but we can extend the proof in such a way that we can eliminate this sequence, and this is how it can be done. So here at line 7, now it's eliminated. So there was an extension of the proof where it was eliminated, and therefore it was not finally derived at that moment yet. Now the question is, can we extend the proof further such that it is finally derived? Now recall that the information was P, not P and Q. So in this case, you would definitely want Q to be non-monotonically entailed. It's not part of the conflict which we see here between P and not P. So it would be very intuitive to derive Q. And yes, we can do so if we extend the proof further in such a way that we attack Q's attacker. And we attack Q's attacker, it's based on an inconsistent support set. And we can attack an inconsistent support set simply with an attacker which doesn't have any support, with an empty support set. So with this one on line 2, we saw this one was already finally derived at that very stage. And now we use it in order to defend our Q. And that will help us to finally derive Q as well. Now, why is it finally derived now? Now, the answer is because it is accepted currently, and now we can't extend the proof further such that it becomes eliminated again, because it's only possible attacker. This one is now already eliminated, and for good. We can't defend it anymore. Good. Next question is this argument here finally derived? And now what you would expect is, no, it shouldn't even be finally derivable at all, because there is also not P around, and there's no way to resolve this conflict. And that's exactly what happens. So yes, we can always extend any proof in which this one is accepted in such a way that it is eliminated again. And the way we do so is simply always by introducing this attacker, not P. So we can basically flip-flop the behavior between accepting P implies not P and not P implies not P. We can flip-flop the proof that at any stage we either have the first one, P implies P accepted, or the other one, not P implies not P accepted. So there's some kind of non-convergence behavior here. And that's exactly what is needed in order to make something not finally derivable. Okay, so this is how this dynamics plays out. So what we have in sum is that Q is entailed by this information and P is not entailed due to this flip-flopping behavior, to the non-convergence. Okay, so this is how dynamic derivations work. So now let's look at some meta-theoretic results. I already mentioned on the fly several desiderata we would have for such derivations, and now we can check whether it actually is well-behaved a notion of proof or not. So the first thing we have to notice is, and this we saw already in the first part, that the question what meta-theoretic properties we get, so rationality properties and others, properties of non-monotonic reasoning, etc., all depend very, very much on how we define, for instance, the base logic. What kind of logic are we dealing with? Or how do we define attacks, etc. So we have to zoom in, so to say, on a certain class of settings in order to answer our question positively, because if we use the wrong logic or the wrong type of attacks, we will definitely not land somewhere in a feasible area. So here's an example. So if you, for instance, would have a setting, I didn't specify now one, but one can easily make up one, which allows for irresolvable odd cycles like this one, then the following would happen in a proof. So you would introduce these arguments, and now you could introduce an attack. So S1 attacks S2, next attack S3. We can introduce this attack. S3 is currently not eliminated or attacked, and this one attacks S1. This is also a coherent situation. Why? Because the active attacker is now S3. This attack is rendered inactive, so S2 is not eliminated anymore. S1 is eliminated, S3 is the attacker, and what is accepted currently is S3 and S2, because its attack is inactive. Now, if we want to continue this proof, we have a hard time. We cannot do this. We cannot introduce an attacker of S3. Why? Because this would lead to incoherence. You can easily check it. So if this one attacks S3, S3 is now inactive. This attack is inactive. S3 is eliminated. This attack, however, becomes active again because S1 is not anymore eliminated by S3. So this is active again. So S1 actively attacks S2. So S2 is eliminated. However, here it was already counted as an active attacker. So you have incoherence again. So you can't introduce this line. In fact, you can't do anything interesting anymore at that moment. And that means that at this moment, S3 and S2 are finally derived. If I would have done the proof differently, I could have done the same thing just with S3 and S1 or S2 and S1. So I could, depending on how I build up the proof, I could derive 2 out of the 3 arguments. But it's arbitrary what I do. And so we have a violation of invariance of proving things of final derivability, because it depends now on the way I introduce certain things in the proof, on the order I introduce certain things in the proof, what is finally derivable. It's also not very intuitive to have S1, S3, and S2 finally derivable, because after all, these 3 arguments are conflicting with one another. So such things we would really like to avoid. And so we have to look at a certain class of settings which are more well-behaved than giving rise, for instance, to such odd cycles, because the dynamic proofs can't deal with them in a proper way. Okay, so this 2 desiderata we can derive from this. So we want proof invariance of final derivability. It shouldn't depend on how I build up the proof, what is finally derivable. And second, we wouldn't want to have conflicting derivations. Okay, so let's look at some simple properties of final derivability. So the first thing is, if an argument has been finally derived in some proof, then it will also be finally derived in any extension of the proof. Now, this follows directly from the definition of final derivability. This is nothing deep. However, we would like to have this property, so to say, cross different derivations. So what we would like to have is that if an argument is finally derived in some proof from S, then every proof from S, D prime, should be such that I can extend this proof, however it looks like, to a D double prime in such a way that this specific argument is also finally derived. So it shouldn't depend on how I build up the proof, whether something is finally derivable in that proof or not. So in order to establish that desideratum, we looked at a specific class of settings. And this class of settings is called SAC, SACS, for support attacking contrapositive. So what this class of settings has, it has 2 properties. First property is it admits contraposition. So if I have this sequence here, then I should be able to shuffle things from the right to the left and from left to the right in the following way. So for instance, I can move a subset from theta to the left-hand side, and I can move a subset of delta to the right-hand side. Just here is a negation, huh? Don't oversee that. So this is a typical instance of contraposition. We also only need this instance of contraposition to be admissible in order for things to work. The other thing is that the attacking rules should only consist of attacks in premises. So if you remember from Ofer's part of the talk, there were several attack rules which attack the premises of the support of sequence, and others attack the conclusions of sequence. So we are now looking at settings which only have attacks in supports. That was undercut, like in my example previously, defeat, consistency undercut was playing a deeper role in Ofer's part of the talk, etc. So in order to get the contraposition rolling, for instance, the calculus could have these 3 rules, these 3 rather standard rules for negation, shifting negation from left to right and right to left, and the conjunction rule on the left-hand side. This is already enough to make this type of contraposition admissible. So now, if we have such a SAC framework, a SAC setting, then our desideratum from before is met. So it is the case that if something is finally derivable in one proof, and you give me any other proof from the same information, I can extend the proof in such a way that this very same argument will also be finally derived. Okay. We also define another class of settings, a more general class of settings, which has this property. And in order to define this class, I have to first say a little bit more about the basic ingredients. The first thing is we distinguish here between so-called root arguments. These are arguments which are not attacked by any other argument. Then the arguments which are attacked by the root arguments, here denoted by root plus. I'm using the same notation as Ofer had. So the plus denotes everything which is attacked by, here the arguments in the root. And so just think about it graph theoretically, the roots have simply no connections incoming. These ones are the ones which have connections incoming from the root arguments. And now everything else we call the inner framework. So everything but the root and everything which is attacked by the roots. So this is the inner framework. Now, the weakly symmetric settings, they really have constraints on this inner framework. The idea is the following. So there has to be a way to partition the inner framework by means of an equivalence relation on these arguments in the inner framework in such a way that if I look at the quotient structure, now given this equivalence relation, so if I look at the big blocks here, which the equivalent relation gives me, the partitions, then it has to be that if I have an attack from one part of the partition to the next, then I also have a back attack. So basically the quotient structure, if I look at the quotient structure of the inner graph, then the attack relation is on this quotient structure symmetric. So these kind of frameworks which have this property that I can find an equivalence relation such that the inner graph, the inner framework has this property of symmetry. These frameworks we call weakly symmetric. Now, one thing is, for instance, sets are weakly symmetric. One way to see that is you can define the equivalence relation by simply saying every argument is equivalent to another argument if and only if they have exactly the same support. You could also play the same game by saying they are equivalent in case their supports are logically equivalent in classical logic. That would also work. And now for weakly symmetric settings, so this is now a larger class of settings, also our property of proof invariance is true. So this desiderata, which I mentioned earlier, is again fulfilled. Okay, let's look at some sanity checks, so to say. So let's check the rationality of our entailment relation. Does it have intuitive properties, yes or no? So again, we are working on the basis of a given setting. So you will sometimes now see this derivability relation symbol, which is the derivability relation underlying our logic L. So our calculus C is adequate with respect to this derivability relation. So this holds. Now, the first is a very simple property. It says if you have no attacks, then our non-monotonic entailment induced by dynamic derivations is exactly the same as what the base logic gives us in terms of consequences. Next one says you always get a subset of what the base logic gives you in terms of non-monotonic entailment. Also, if you have a conflict-free set, so basically an input set which doesn't give rise to argumentative attacks, then you will also get exactly the same. Our non-monotonic entailment will be exactly the same as the entailment underlying the base logic. If you have only attacks in premises, like in sex, then you again have the situation that it's not again, this is different now, that the theorems, so anything which is derivable without any input information in the base logic, will also be a theorem of the non-monotonic entailment, and vice versa. Okay, and the second thing is basically just a different way of expressing the same idea. Proposition 8, this is already more advanced. This is really a requirement you sometimes see also mentioned as some kind of rationality requirement for non-monotonic entailments. And that is, if a non-monotonic entailment is based on a certain base logic, then what you would like to have is that this non-monotonic entailment is closed under the entailment of the base logic. So if you apply rules from the base logic to non-monotonic entailed formulas, then whatever you get should still be non-monotonically entailed as well. And this is exactly expressed here. So the non-monotonic entailment is closed under the entailment of the base logic. Good. Okay, here is another desideratum. It says, okay, so this has to do with relevance. So what we would like to do is that we don't have the situation that certain type of information disturbs the non-monotonic entailment we have if this additional information is not really relevant to the support or to the defeat of the kind of information which we derived. So this can be expressed in two ways, in a syntactic way or in a semantic way. The way to express it semantically is, for instance, in terms of non-monotonic and reasoning principles. So for instance, cautious monotony says, so if phi and psi are both non-monotonically entailed by a certain set of information, then if I add something which is already entailed by this set of information, then the other thing which was already entailed should not be entailed anymore. So we want a certain robustness of non-monotonic entailment under its own conclusions. So the own conclusions shouldn't disturb the entailment behavior. So this is a robustness property. We could also say it the other way around. If I can derive something by adding certain conclusions, certain entailments to it, then it should be already entailed without adding this. This would be cautious cut. Ofer was talking about that. This is also this kind of relevance criteria. Another way to spell out relevance is in a syntactic way. So I could say adding irrelevant information can be seen in a syntactic way by saying that the irrelevance is simply that the added information here, S2, doesn't share any atoms with the information which I have in S1 and its conclusion psi. So psi is entailed by S1, but this new information which I add now, S2, shares no atoms with it, and therefore psi should still be entailed by S1 and S2, and vice versa. So this is what in argumentation theory is sometimes called non-interference. So again, it is a robustness property. So the entailment should be robust under the addition of information which is not relevant. Okay, so here's the good news. If we use sex as underlying settings, then the entailment is cautiously monotonic. It actually is even cumulative. I will come to that in a second. For non-interference, I want to shortly make a connection with some other notions. One of the two I will use now in order to spell out our results. So non-interference is quite intimately connected to two other notions which you may have heard before. One is the notion of uniformity, which is a weaker notion. So uniformity relative to a certain entailment is the following property. So if I have that S1 and S2 implies psi, but I know that the atoms of S2 so S2 doesn't share any atoms with S1 and psi, so just like in non-interference, but additionally, I also know that S1 is consistent, then this entailment should be robust. So it should be the case that also S1 already entails this psi. So this is a much weaker property, and we will use it now. I will already show you my proposition here. We will use it now for our proposition, because if we know that the underlying logic of our setting is uniform, for instance, classical logic is uniform, then it implies that our non-monotonic entailment is satisfies the property of non-interference, so this stronger property. So we go from some weaker property for the base logic to a stronger property for the non-monotonic entailment. There's also this basic relevance criterion, which you may have encountered or not. It is very similar to what we see here in non-interference. Basically, it is one direction of non-interference. And the other direction you would get if you would have a monotonic logic. So If you want to see a more general result for logical and structured augmentation concerning non-interference, there is a paper, do I have it here? No, I mentioned it later on by Annemarie Borg and myself. It was ICHKAI 2018, where we basically show that if the underlying logic of any kind of logical argumentation theory satisfies the basic relevance criterion, then you get non-interference for the resulting entailment. But that was not about dynamic derivations. This was more about the general logical argumentation and Dung semantics. But there we didn't have any restrictions then really, or very minimal restrictions on the kind of setting we're looking at. Okay. Another notion which is often mentioned in the connection with non-interference is contamination. So contamination is the following. So what you would want to avoid is that you have a certain set of sentences such that if something is derivable from this set of sentences, then it is also derivable from the set of sentences together with any arbitrary set of sentences. Where the only property that this arbitrary set of sentences should fulfill is that it doesn't share atoms with your starting set. So you can think about this in classical logic. What would that be? This would be logical explosion. So S would be an inconsistent set. From an inconsistent set, you get anything. And if you add anything to the inconsistent set, you still get anything. So this is logical explosion. In non-monotonic circumstances, you can also think of logical implosion. That would be situations that a certain set doesn't produce any entailments. This is, for instance, in default logic, this is possible because there you can have situations where you don't have extensions as a side note. So such situations you would like to avoid ideally. And indeed, crash resistance says we don't want to have any contaminating sets. They shouldn't exist. So this is another rationality requirement. Our entailment relation should be crash resistance. It should never be the case that any set of sentences contaminates information. And indeed, we can prove that. This is usually just a corollary to non-interference. So under very simple requirements, this directly follows from non-interference, which is nice. Okay, now I'm looking a bit at non-monotonic inference and properties of our entailment. So what kind of properties of non-monotonic inference, for instance, of this scheme which you have seen in Ofer's talk from Krauss, Lehmann, and Magidor, and this kind of categorization of different non-monotonic entailments, where does our entailment fall, the entailment of dynamic derivations? And so here you see again the properties of cumulative inference. So a cautious reflexivity. So if you have a non-contradictory formula, it should follow from itself. It should be entailed by itself. Beware, this is not the usual reflexivity requirement you have, for instance, for Tarskian logics, so for monotonic logics, where it usually reads something like this. So if you have any set here, then a member of the set should be entailed. This is much stronger. This is something which we usually don't want in non-monotonic circumstances. Cautious monotony, you already saw. Cautious cut is basically cautious monotony in the other direction. I talked shortly about it. Left logical equivalence is very simple. If something is derivable from a set of formulas and you replace one of the members of your set of formulas with a logically equivalent formula, it should still be derivable. Right weakening says, yeah, this was basically disclosure under the base logic. It says if something is entailed non-monotonically from a set of information and something strictly follows in view of the base logic follows from what has been entailed, then also what strictly follows should still be entailed. Okay. Do I have here a typo? Yeah, this should be a this should be the entailment, the snaky symbol. Okay, good. What we have proven is that if you're dealing with a SEC, then the underlying entailment and underlying non-monotonic entailment is cumulative with respect to the entailment relation of the base logic. Okay, so this is nice. It falls in a very well-behaved category of non-monotonic inference relations. is it even stronger? Is it a preferential consequence relation? If in that case, it would have to fulfill also this reasoning by cases principle. So if you can derive sigma from a set of information with phi and also from the set of information with psi, then you should be able to derive it from the set of information with phi or psi. So this is really an instance of reasoning by cases. And this doesn't hold. Here is a simple example. It's an example which looks similar to what Ofer has been looking at in the context of maximal consistent subsets. So here we have a consistent set. We start with a consistent set, P and Q and P and R. But now if we add not Q, then we can get P. What happens if we add not Q, short comment? Then we get the conflict between not Q and this first premise. This premise here is an innocent bystander, is not involved in the conflict, and so we will be able to derive this argument. Just like in my example before, where we had P, not P, and Q, we could derive the argument for Q. This is the same here. Similarly, if we add not R, then we have a conflict in the second premise, and the first one becomes an innocent bystander, and therefore the argument concluding P and Q, and also the argument concluding P, will be entailed by means of dynamic derivations. However, if we add now not Q or not R, then we get a different situation. Now we get mutual attack. So if we combine this new information with the first premise, we can attack the second premise. If we combine it with the second premise, we can attack the first premise. And that will lead to a situation, as you also saw before already, where you get this kind of flip-flop behavior. So the dynamic derivations will not converge. And that means P will not be finally derived. Okay. Now let's look at relations with argumentation semantics. So after all, we are talking about argumentative attacks all the time. So are there deeper connections with argumentation selections in terms of dung types semantics, which we can establish between dynamic proofs and the underlying argumentation frameworks? So for that, we have to first define what would be the underlying argumentation framework of a given dynamic derivation. So let's say D is a simple derivation. So in particular, can be a dynamic derivation. And then we define the argumentation framework induced by this derivation in the following way. So we look at all derived sequence, which are based, whose support is included in S. And then we look at all the attacks between them, which have been established in the proof. And by that, I mean, we simply look so S attacks T, just in case there is an elimination tuple where S is the attacker and T is the eliminated. So one thing to notice here is that this notion here of attack doesn't consider the evaluation of the derivation. It just looks, in order to determine what attacks what, it just looks purely syntactically, do I have an elimination tuple around where one is the attacker and the other one is eliminated? Now, if we evaluate the proof, it could still happen that this is not an active attack in the proof. The associated argumentation framework doesn't care about this. It just scans through the proof, looks for elimination tuples, and determines the attacks on that basis. So here's an example. This is our old proof, which we have seen several times now in classical logic. And this would be the associated attack diagram, the associated argumentation framework. So it simply scans through the proof and looks whenever it sees an elimination tuple, it says, okay, the argument on the right attacks the argument on the left. And this is exactly how the red arrows here came into existence. In contrast, this would be the argumentation framework which we would get if we would only look at the active attacks. So if we would actually look at the evaluated dynamic derivation. And they look obviously differently because some of these attacks are inactive if we evaluate this dynamic derivation. So, okay, so now we will establish a connection between stable sets of the associated attack diagram of a dynamic derivation with the accepted arguments given the evaluation of this dynamic derivation. So this works as follows. If we have a simple derivation which is coherent, then the set accept of D, so where the evaluation procedure says this is an accepted argument because it's not eliminated, establishes a stable extension of this associated attack diagram. So in this case, these were the accepted, in green, these were the accepted arguments. And you see this exactly corresponds to a stable extension. So just a reminder, a stable extension was one such that it is conflict-free and it attacks every argument which is not in it. So here, this is conflict-free, the green one, and every argument outside of it is attacked by it. So this is a stable extension, which is exactly the set of accepted arguments. You also see that it doesn't work the other way around. Not every, okay, here you don't see, but you can see easily find an example. This is not the case that every stable extension will be accepted at that moment. Yeah, you have only one set of arguments which is accepted at the moment. Okay, good. Another connection is the connection to maximal consistent subsets. So Ofer already established lots of results that sequence-based argumentation is intimately connected to maximal consistent subsets. And the same holds for dynamic derivations. So just as a reminder, so this was the definition of phi being skeptically induced by maximal consistent subsets from a given set of information S. It meant simply that we look at the intersection of all maximal consistent subsets of S and check whether phi is derivable classically from it. And now, as we are talking classical logic, we are looking again at the setting with classical logic, LK, and undercut. And what we can then see is that the entailment based on maximal consistent subset is exactly the same as the entailment based on dynamic derivations for finite input sets. And more, it also is equivalent to the entailments based on the same setting, given the static, so the non-derivational surroundings which Ofer presented. So if we just look at the augmentation frameworks and apply Dung semantics and then define the entailments just as Ofer did, then we get also exactly the same. So this falls all together here. And it's even independent of the given Dung semantics one applies. So for grounded, for skeptical stable, and for skeptical preferred, we all get the same entailment. So here are some examples, but I think I will skip them. You saw several examples of maximal consistent subset reasoning in Ofer's part of the talk, so we don't need to go through that. However, I want to present you another result, namely for the stronger type of maximal consistent subset-based entailments, which was the one which says something is entailed if and only if it is entailed by every maximal consistent subset. Ofer gave you some examples which showed that this is really a stronger notion of entailment. Here you have an example. It's maybe even the same which Ofer had, I don't know. So here is an example. You have P and Q and P and not Q. With the stronger notion of maximal consistent subset entailment, you get P, sometimes called a floating conclusion in non-monotonic logic. Why? Because you have two maximal consistent subsets. One is simply the singleton consisting of the first premise. One is the singleton consisting of the second premise. And from both, obviously, P is derivable. But if you look at the intersection, it's the empty set. That's why P is not derivable in the previous weaker notion of a maximal consistent subset related entailment. So the question is, can we derive or can we define a variant of dynamic derivations which gives us this entailment? And the idea is, yes, we can do that. We just have to define a different notion of final derivability. So we now change the notion of final derivability and in the following way. So the first part is still the same. So now we call it sparsely finally derived. So when is an argument sparsely finally derived? Well, we have to have it accepted at that stage of the proof, in the proof which we are looking at. And if we extend the proof, now before we said it should not be eliminated in any extension, now we change this part of final derivability in the following way. We weaken this a bit. We say that if you extend the proof in any way to a derivation d prime, then what has to be the case? There still has to be an argument for the same conclusion, but maybe with a different support. It can be still the same support, or it is a different support. This also shows you immediately that this is a stronger notion of entailment than the previous one, because the previous definition is just a special case of this definition. And in this way, we basically can capture this notion of maximal consistent entailment. So what happens here in our example is that we get this kind of flip-flopping behavior I was talking about before. So we will have some stages where the one argument for P based on P and Q is eliminated, and then the other argument will be eliminated and this one will be active again. And so it will flip-flop around. It will not converge in the sense that some arguments are really stable except for theorems, but none of the arguments for P will be stably derived in the sense that they are not eliminated at a later stage. However, there will be in any extension of the proof always an argument for P which is accepted, namely either the one based on P and Q or the one based on P and not Q. So this will be the case. So there is a certain convergence, but it's a convergence on conclusions rather than a convergence on arguments. And this is captured by this definition of sparsely finally derived formulas in this case. Okay, so this is the way to capture the other notion of maximal consistent subset related entailments. Okay, here are some pointers to possible future work. So currently there are 2 publications out which deal with dynamic derivations, but there's still much work to be done. I think one very important part is computational complexity studies. So currently we have no computational complexity studies on these systems. Another thing which would be very nice is to have proof heuristics or goal-directed proofs. So proofs which are more streamlined. If you want to prove a certain formula or a certain argument, which give you a streamlined procedure to get there, so to say, in with minimal effort. Also to internalize the notion of final derivability. As you could see, the final derivability was somewhat a meta notion. It basically quantifies overall possible extensions of the proof. So now the question would be, can one find some ways to integrate more of the needed information in the proof itself, which can determine by reading off the information which we have in the proof, so that we could determine maybe in some cases, maybe in all cases, whether something is finally derivable without having to reason about the possible extensions of the proofs. So there are several ways one could go about that. One is, for instance, by means of working with anti-sequent calculi. So this idea has been successfully used before in the context of sequent calculi for non-monotonic logics, here in a paper by Bonatti and Olivetti. So the idea is an anti-sequent would be a sequent which establishes that something is not derivable from a certain support. And if you can establish that, then you can maybe establish certain information which is relevant to final derivability, in that it excludes that certain attackers could be still derived in future extensions of the proof, because as an anti-sequent has already established that certain support sets cannot be used for attacking. So this will be one way of internalizing some information which is used for the final derivability in a proof. Of course, currently we only studied this SACs and the weakly symmetric settings and checked what their meta-theoretic properties are for dynamic derivations, but one can, of course, expand this and look at other settings. So go beyond, for instance, just support attacks, etc., etc. Okay, so here comes the second part of my talk, of my part of the tutorial. Now I will talk more about the role of logical argumentation in this landscape, in this rather broad landscape of non-monotonic logic. So in order to do this, I need to somewhat make categories among non-monotonic logics. So I have to fit them into specific families. In order to do so, I have to simplify somehow and to idealize somehow. So, so I try to do this in such a way that you can see the role of logical argumentation in a good way. But of course, your favorite system of non-monotonic logic may now not be mentioned properly in what I do, but I have to yeah, make certain limitations here. So first of all, the zoo of non-monotonic logic is very, very broad. As you can see in this picture, and this is just an excerpt of the systems which have been around. So in green, you see systems which are around in non-monotonic logic, among many others. And in blue, you see papers which establish connections between different families of non-monotonic logics. So people are very interested in showing that certain ways of reasoning non-monotonically can be expressed in other systems. So if you look, for instance, at Dung's paper from 1995, it has this strong ambition that argumentation theory should be something like a unifying framework of non-monotonic logic. So the idea is really that why argumentation? Because it's very natural to think about defeasible reasoning in terms of the interplay of arguments. So in terms of arguments defeating one another. As it is so natural, one would like to have a representational format which captures this idea. And Dung presented one of them, and people before him like Pollock did already. But of course, in order to show that it really suffices for a unifying framework, one has to now go out and do the hard work and show that specific families of non-monotonic logic can indeed be embedded or expressed in argumentation. And so that's why scholars have been working hard on these translations. And now what I will try to do is to present you some of these results. But before that, I have to give you some basic ideas about how specific families of non-monotonic logics work. So first of all, the first difference you can see between different types of non-monotonic logics is that they are working with different, let's call them knowledge bases, but I have a very broad notion here of knowledge bases because it also features the rules, so that the logical parts of the way we deal, the way we reason with information. So first of all, we have here on the left, we have assumptions. So this is in our context, it would be simply propositional formulas, or it can be first order formulas. It is simply the information with which you deal with. But as Ofer already mentioned, the information can have different qualities. So it can be information you are certain about. That would be strict information. This is this AS here. Or it could be information which is defeasible information, just some assumptions you make. So this is the first part of the knowledge base. But then how do you reason with that? So again, different approaches to non-monotonic logic have your different ideas of how we reason with given information. Some say we only need strict rules. So we only need something like classical logic, and then we have to deal with it in some tricky ways. You will see some of them in what follows. So they would say this is very essential. Other frameworks also introduce so-called defeasible rules as primitives. So you have the defeasible rules. The idea is that if you have the antecedent of a rule and the conclusion of a rule, that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the antecedent, but just most probably or most likely or by default. Okay. And sometimes you even see some frameworks which have meta rules, so rules which allow you to derive new defeasible rules from already given defeasible rules. So here you see a little bit of an overview of different frameworks and what kind of ingredients they work with. So maximal consistent subsets, as they were classically defined, you saw them several times now in the talk, work with defeasible assumptions and strict rules, namely classical logic in the classical setting. Defeasible assumptions, as it has been introduced by David Michelson, adds something, namely also strict assumptions. So otherwise they work just like maximal consistent subsets. Default logic is the paradigmatic approach, which works with genuinely defeasible rules. So not defeasible rules which are somehow simulated by strict rules and defeasible assumptions, but genuinely defeasible rules. Input-output logic would be a logic where at least the derivational part of it works with these funny meta rules. Okay, adaptive logics work similar to default assumptions. Aspic is the big contender in structured argumentation, which works with primitive defeasible rules, in addition to strict rules, in addition to defeasible assumptions, in addition to strict assumptions. So you have the whole palette, so to say, in Aspic. Logic programming has defeasible assumptions and strict rules. Logical argumentation is what we have been using now, works with strict assumptions, defeasible assumptions, and strict rules, but so far, not with defeasible rules, at least not as a primitive. So you see lots of different approaches structure the way we we structure our knowledge is done in a different way in these different frameworks. Okay, but of course one can reduce certain types, certain parts of the knowledge base to others. So for instance, strict assumptions could be simply modeled by strict rules with an empty antecedent. Or if you have a defeasible assumption, you can also embed them in defeasible rules if you work with them by simply defeasible rules, which have an empty body. There is also a tradition of thinking about defeasible rules as strict rules plus defeasible assumptions. So a defeasible rule here with the double arrow would be encoded by something like this, which basically says, okay, the left-hand side is the same, the right-hand side is the same, but here you add something as an additional body of the rule. Namely, you say, oh, you don't want to have an exceptional situation. So this will be something which expresses an exceptional situation. If this is triggered, the rule is not triggered. So if the exceptional situation occurs, then the rule is not triggered. This is one way to think about defeasibility. And sometimes cashed out as the difference between defeasible reasoning. This is reasoning where you have genuinely defeasible rules, and plausible reasoning where you have only strict rules, but you work on the basis of defeasible assumptions. Okay, so let's look at non-monotonic entailment. So how do these different frameworks think about non-monotonic entailment? So here is my way of bringing this all together. So you always start with a defeasible knowledge base. And in the end of the day, you want to know what should I defeasibly infer from it. And so what all these approaches in non-monotonic logic have in common on a very abstract level is that they somehow gather consistent chunks of information from the knowledge base, which are somewhat representative of a rational stance. But how they cache this out, how they extract consistent chunks, and what consistent chunks really are, this is very different in the different approaches. So you have syntax-based approaches, they build extensions. Extensions can be, that would be the argumentative approach, that would be arguments built on the basis of this knowledge base. So it would be sets of arguments, and consistency would be cached out in terms of, for instance, Tung-style argumentation semantics. This would be the consistent chunk of information. Or you do it differently, like in maximal consistent subsets, as you have seen, you build consistent sets of assumptions from your knowledge base. So here the extensions would now be part of the, so it would be subsets of the defeasible part of the knowledge. So for instance, it would be defeasible assumptions or defeasible rules. That would be your extensions. So this is another way of going about it in a syntactic way. But you can also do semantics. So you have a semantics first approach, and then you look at models, you look at interpretations of your knowledge base, and then you have to say which interpretations are better than others. So you define which are the preferred interpretations, and that gives you a non-monotonic entailment. So, but all of them, they work on the basis of a knowledge base, and they give us ways to extract consistent chunks of information and to prefer some over others. Okay, so in the syntax-based approaches, the notion of argument somehow always plays a role. That's why I have to talk a little bit more about it, because different approaches differ in the way they define what an argument is. So for instance, in some approaches, arguments are proof trees. One of the central approaches here would be Aspig. So this is typically when the defeasible rules are genuine defeasible rules. So you don't simulate them by means of strict rules, but you have primitive defeasible rules. In this case, often people work with proof trees. The reason is, I will talk a little bit more about this later, but the reason is that you can define more ways of attacking arguments then. So proof trees, I will not go through the definition. I will just look at the example here. So here you have an example of a knowledge base. So different rules, some strict rules, some defeasible rules. The strict I always denote by the single arrow, the defeasible by the double arrow. You have some assumptions like P here. And the way you build arguments is simply by chaining the rules, basically. Of course, it gets more complicated if you have rules with multiple bodies and so on and so forth, but this is how you do it. So here in this case, you get 6 arguments. I forgot here the 6th one. Okay, and the other way, and this is the way you already saw it in sequence-based argumentation, is to simply define arguments as pairs, as premise-conclusion pairs. So you say an argument is given by gamma, comma, phi if the strict rules allow you to derive phi from gamma. And how you do this, yeah, this depends what your underlying proof system is. This is typically done when the strict arguments, the defeasible arguments are empty, or you model them by means of strict arguments and defeasible assumptions. Okay, so now let's look a bit more deeper into the syntactical approaches. As I said, there are two syntactical approaches. The ones based on building extensions as parts of the defeasible parts of a knowledge base, and the others based on arguments. So I will first look a little bit at the first approach, and I will distinguish basically two ways of doing so. Once you have a notion of extension, then you can build, you can have different notions of entailment, and Ofer basically mentioned already the different notions of entailment. So there's skeptical and there's credulous. Either you look at the intersection of all your extensions, or you look at their union. So this is the difference between skeptical and credulous. And then with skeptical, you can make a further sub-distinction. Either you look at all the conclusions of all the arguments you have, or you look at all the arguments which are in the intersection. But you will see some details later. But let's look first at the syntactical approaches, which I call accumulation methods, because they can be cashed out in terms of an accumulation procedure. And the most famous accumulation procedure has been defined by Reiter in his default logic, but it is one which applies to also other approaches of non-monotonic logic. So here it is. So this will be the greedy accumulation procedure. So now we want to build, if given a certain knowledge base, we want to build extensions as being parts of the defeasible part of a knowledge base. So defeasible assumptions and defeasible rules. How do we do that? So we first initialize our extension with the empty set, and now we build it step by step. That's why I call it the accumulation method. And the way we do so is in every step, we look, so is there still a defeasible element which we have not yet been considering, which is triggered and consistent with the defeasible elements we have so far collected? And what do I mean by triggered and consistent? So first of all, when I write def of k, this is k is the knowledge base, here cashed out in terms of defeasible assumptions, strict assumptions, and some inference rules. And if I write this, I mean just the defeasible part of the knowledge base. Now, when I write this here, these are the arguments based on the defeasible part. So these are all the arguments you can build by only using the defeasible elements here and all the strict elements you have. So basically, before in the example before, this would be if I only look at, for instance, this rule and this rule, I could only build this argument P, I could build the argument A2, I could build the argument A3, and I could build the argument A5, but not the ones below. So this is the idea here behind the notion of argument. And now I can define what I mean by triggering. So when is a defeasible element triggered by the elements I have already? Well, if it is an assumption, it is always triggered because it doesn't have it. You can think about it as an empty-headed, empty-bodied rule. And if it is a rule, if it is a defeasible rule, we have to check whether the body of the rule is a consequence of all the arguments I can build on the basis of the defeasible information I already collected. You will see an example in a second. So, if this is a triggered and consistent information with everything I have been collecting so far, then I add it to my collection. I do this until I can't anymore, and then I return whatever I ended up with. And this is what Reiter calls a default extension. Okay. Yeah, consistency I didn't talk about, but consistency means, an assumption would be consistent if its negation is not derivable from what you had already. And a rule is consistent, well, if either it is not triggered, then there's no problem with it. Or if it is triggered, the conclusion of the rule should be consistent with everything you have so far derived. Okay, so this is the greedy procedure. I will also shortly introduce another notation here. This trick with the top basically is the set of all defeasible information which is triggered by the defeasible information you have collected so far, and it is also consistent with it. I introduced this notation because later on I will show you how this can be also characterized. So this iterative procedure can also be characterized in terms of a fixed point. Now we move to the other approach, which is similar to the one which we just saw, the greedy approach. I call it the temperate approach, temperate accumulation, but it is something which you find very, very often in non-monotonic logic. So default assumptions are based on it, maximal consistent subsets are based on it, input-output logic is based on it, etc., etc. Adaptive logic is based on it. So it's pretty much the same procedure. The only thing which is different is that when I add a new information, I don't look whether it is triggered, I just check the consistency. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as before. Let's look how they apply to this very simple example here. So if I do, so here you have 3 different runs of the algorithm. The first 3 runs will be both greedy and temperate, and the 4th is just temperate accumulation. It will not be a run in greedy. So let's see what we do. So in the first step, we have to check. So we have to look for a defeasible element of our knowledge base, which is consistent and triggered, or in case of temperate accumulation, which is simply just consistent. And so we can, for instance, if we are greedy, so we have P is a strict assumption in our knowledge base. So we have that. So this default here is triggered, P implies Q, and P implies not R is also triggered. So we have 2 choices for the greedy one, for the first type of information which we add. In temperate accumulation, we can also add this default, despite the fact that it is not triggered currently. In the second round, now we add another default which is triggered in terms of greedy. So for instance, if we edit first P implies Q, we can, so let's look at run 3. If we added already P implies Q, now a new default is triggered, namely the one which starts with Q, and we can add this default. In temperate accumulation, we only have to take care of consistency. All 3 runs end here because we can't add all 3 defaults in any case, however we do it, in whatever order we do it, because this would lead to a conflict, because then we get not R and R. So this is where it ends. And this is the arguments which the different runs of these procedures give us, and these are the consequences. And this information now, so this is what these accumulation procedures would output as extensions, and now we can use these extensions in order to define non-monotonic entailment. This is why we did it. This is our consistent chunk of information, which we were after. As you can already see, temperate accumulation gives us more extensions, and therefore it will lead to a more cautious style of reasoning. Okay, if you have no defeasible rules, then both procedures will do exactly the same. This is the case of maximal consistent subsets, for instance. There, it doesn't matter whether you're greedy or not. You can also characterize both procedures in terms of fixed points, which is very often done. Like the greedy procedure would be a fixed point of this function here, which I defined earlier, and the temperate extension would be a fixed point of the consistency operator, which I defined earlier. And it is the same as a maximal consistent subset. So these 2 procedures, greedy and temperate accumulation, are very central in non-monotonic entailment. And now when you have extensions, you can define entailments just in the way as described. So either skeptical or credulous. If you're skeptical, you can look at all the sentences which are shared among the extensions. That would be this one. Or this is the conclusion focused one, or you can look at all the arguments which are shared among the extensions. And this is exactly the same way we define entailment in the argumentation based approach, just that there the extensions are not sets of defeasible elements of the knowledge base, but there the extensions are sets of arguments one can build from the knowledge base. Okay, so let's look at how this cashes out. If we look, for instance, at the skeptical approach, which is based on the conclusions. Now, if we look at greedy, we have basically 2 extensions. These are the 2 extensions. Now we look at the intersection of all the conclusions which we have. This is P, Q, and S. So this will be entailed by greedy. If we have temperate, we have 3 temperate extensions. We look again at the intersection. Here we only get Q. With the arguments, we look at the intersection of the arguments. Here we have A1 and A2. And then we look at what these arguments conclude. So you can check here, A1 and A2, they conclude P and Q. So we get a little bit less. So this is typically the entailment based on arguments. Is a little bit more cautious than the one based on conclusions. In temperate, we only just get P. And the credulous approach simply scans for all the conclusions which we get in any of the extensions. Good. The argumentation method is not so different from the extension-based method, from the accumulation method, except that the extensions now are sets of arguments. And how do we select sets of arguments? Well, we have to pick an argumentation semantics. So for instance, one could say, we are interested in stable semantics. Then one looks at the stable extensions of the given argumentation framework, which is built by this knowledge base. So it's very different. Before we just accumulated diffusible information, and then in the end we checked always, is it consistent? And the accumulation was done in two different ways, either greedy or non-greedy. Here we do something entirely different. We build argumentation frameworks, then we look at semantics, and the semantics decide what arguments to accept. So the arguments are now the primitive notion, so to say. And we can define exactly the same entailment relations. And here it has been done. I don't think I have to go through the details of what is the outcome. But you see, this is very similar in some respects, but also quite different, because the primitive notion here is the argument. So instead of building consistent chunks in an accumulative way from the knowledge base, we now look at argumentation graphs and then select. Okay. A little bit more on the differences between the different types of argumentation mechanisms. So there is, for instance, ASPIC. ASPIC is a very central system in structured argumentation, and it works in several ways quite different from logical argumentation. So first of all, the terminology is quite different. For instance, so rebut is the one thing where we have the same terminology. A rebut is simply an attack in a conclusion. However, in ASPIC, the conclusion has to be a conclusion which has been derived by means of a defeasible rule, not one which has been derived by means of a strict rule. Now, in logical argumentation, we only had strict rules because we only work with, we don't have a primitive notion of defeasible rules. We only have a logic, and it gives us conclusions. So this is already a slight difference in the way rebut is defined. Undercuts mean something quite different in ASPIC. In undercuts, in logical argumentation, was an attack in the support of an argument. Here, undercuts attack a specific defeasible inference rule, which has been used in the attacked argument. So this is something quite different. Undermining is something which we usually label defeat or undercut in logical-based argumentation. Namely, it is an attack in an assumption of an argument. However, the attacks in ASPIC are typically pointed. So what we call a direct attack, it attacks one specific premise of or one specific underlying assumption of an argument, and not several at once. There are variants of ASPIC which do it different. So here's just an overview, a distinction between logic-based argumentation and ASPIC. So no defeasible rules in logic-based argumentation. Then you can attack in several assumptions at the same time in logic-based argumentation, not in standard ASPIC. There are some variants which do so. You cannot attack in strict conclusions in ASPIC. Again, there are some variants which do so. I will talk about it in the next slide, why this restriction exists. In logic-based argumentation, you can do so. You can attack in defeasible rules in ASPIC, obviously not in logic-based argumentation because we don't have them. So a little bit about why this restriction at all exists in ASPIC. That why can't we rebut in a strict conclusion? So a conclusion which has been derived by means of a strict rule. Here's a very simple example. So you have a very simple knowledge base. S implies P, S implies Q, and S implies not P and Q. S is your strict assumption. So you see there's a conflict here between, there's a triple conflict. P, Q, and not P and Q cannot go together. And we use here as strict rules, the ones induced by classical logic. What you get if you would allow, which they don't in ASPIC, if you would allow for attacks in arguments in conclusions which have been obtained by means of a strict rule. So if you would allow for such rebuts, then you would get, for instance, that A1, which concludes P, attacks A23, which attacks, which concludes not P. So these one would mutually attack each other, like here. And similarly for the other arguments. Now, here comes the problem. You get this argumentation graph now, and now you can select the green arguments, and these green arguments, look what they conclude: P, Q, and not P and Q. And that's of course not good, because that violates the rationality postulate, which Ofer was mentioning several times, that extensions should have a consistent set of conclusions. So this is the reason why in Aspig this is not allowed. If you don't allow for it, the argumentation graph looks like that. So you don't get anymore the attack from A1 to A23. So several of the attack errors will be removed. And now I highlighted them still, but now you can easily see this is not anymore a stable extension. So before the green ones were stable extensions, now they are not anymore. Okay, so this is why this is not allowed in Aspig. You have similar problems, however, also in logical argumentation. So if you would, for instance, use now the undercut rule as the attacking rule for a similar example. So now I have no strict assumptions and only defeasible assumptions. It's again P, Q, and not P and Q, and classical logic as the underlying logic. Then you would run into exactly the same problem. I think Ofer also mentioned it already in the first part of the talk. So you have to do something about this. One way would be to work with directed undercut. And if you have directed undercut, you again avoid the problem. I think this is a nice illustration that you can run into the very same problem from different angles, so to say. One angle would be, you don't restrict the rebut in the proper way. And the other angle is, you allow for a simultaneous attack in several assumptions. Both of these ways of defining attacks lead to trouble, and that shows that both in Aspig and also in logical argumentation, rationality postulates are extremely sensible on the fact on the way we define attack rules. Okay. So here's a little bit of an overview of the connections between these different frameworks. So now I talked about all these syntactical approaches. So I talked about accumulation, about the greedy approach, which is most prominently done in default logic, the temperate approach, which is done in many, many different approaches, from maximal consistent subset-based approaches to some defeasible logics, default logics, which have been defined in the context of deontic logic, for instance. Argumentation, there are many different argumentation frameworks. Forgive me that I didn't talk too much about ABBA. It would, of course, also be very interesting, but there was no time for that. And now it's, of course, interesting to see, to compare the expressive power between these different frameworks and to see whether one can express the other one. Also, if a certain framework has certain unifying ambitions, then it would have to show that it can express defeasible reasoning styles, which have been expressed in other frameworks, at least as long as we think they are reasonable to start with. So there are translations have been established basically in all possible ways you can imagine here. So from ABBA to Aspig, from Aspig to ABBA, from Aspig to logic-based argumentation, from ABBA to logic-based argumentation. But here I have to say it's logic-based argumentation defined in an extremely liberal way. So this is a paper to do it more properly in the context of sequence-based argumentation as defined in this tutorial. This is a challenge for the future. Default logic and Hansen default logic have been translated into Aspig. Default logic has been translated into ABBA. Aspig has been translated into default logic in some sense. So Aspig without undercut and under certain conditions on the strict rules like contraposition and so on can be seen as an instance of default logic, for instance. Ofer talked already a lot about the connections between maximal consistent subsets and different argumentation approaches. There should be an error also from maximal consistent subsets to ABBA, I forgot, unfortunately. Default assumptions have been translated to logic-based argumentation. Input-output logic has partially been translated to logic-based argumentation, etc., etc. So argumentation is a very unifying framework. I think so much we can say for certain now. As the very last part of my talk, I will shortly talk a little bit about the other big approach to non-monotonic logic, and that is in terms of semantics, in terms of semantic selections, preferred models. So I will again simplify things here just to give you the general idea of how this approach works. So I will work now with knowledge bases which have strict assumptions, defeasible assumptions, and which are based on the strict rules provided by some logic, especially a logic which also gives us a semantics, so a model theoretic semantics. So a natural interpretation of saying that the knowledge base defeasibly entails a formula phi is to say that phi holds in the most normal situations that are consistent with the strict assumptions which this knowledge base gives us, and where the normality is somehow based on the defeasible information the knowledge base gives us. So the standard of normality is somewhat based on the defeasible assumptions the knowledge base gives us. So basically we start with a knowledge base. The strict information gives us now, and the underlying logic gives us now the models of the strict assumptions. And the defeasible information should give us an idea of how we can order these models, how we can compare the models in terms of how normal they are, how preferred they are in that respect, because we prefer models which interpret the information the most normal way possible. And one way to do so is to say, okay, if I compare two models here, which are models of the strict information, so I presuppose now that the strict information is at least consistent. If I compare two models, M and M prime, when is one better? When is one more normal than the other one? Well, if it makes more defeasible assumptions true than the other one, that's really the basic idea. So the more defeasible assumptions a model makes true, the better it is. This will be a concrete way of spelling out this preference order. The preference orders have also been studied in the literature on non-monotonic logic in a very abstract way. So like by Kraus, Lehmann, and Magidor, or Ofer also has a very nice paper on this in the context of also paraconsistent logics. So plausibility orders. So there are many ways of looking at the order in a very abstract way. And there are several approaches which give actual content to how this order should look like when you have a given knowledge base. Okay. So here are some authors which use the idea of ordering models and using this in order to give a non-monotonic entailment. Okay. So here is just an example, a simple example again. It is basically exactly the same knowledge base as you saw before, the one with the 6 arguments. I shortly go back because the picture will probably trigger your memory because it looks much nicer as a picture. So it was this knowledge base here. But now I encode it because I don't have defeasible rules. Now I encode the defeasible rules by means of strict rules and these abnormality constants, which basically model exceptions. So you will see in a second how this is done. So basically, instead of having a defeasible rule which says P defeasibly implies Q, I model this as a strict implication, so as a material implication. In this case, we're using classical logic, but I say, okay, the antecedent is also equipped with this specific information which says we shouldn't be in an abnormal situation. And this is an abnormal situation for rule 1. This would be an abnormal situation for rule 2 and one for rule 3. We don't have to specify how this abnormal situation looks like. But of course, if we would have some information about that, we could do so. But in any way, these abnormality constants here, this give us the defeasible assumptions. The defeasible assumptions are simply that we don't have an abnormal situation, that we're in a normal situation with respect to each rule. Now, as you can see, we can't have all 3 of them because then we would run into a conflict. We could derive R and not R. So some assumption has to go. Question is which one and how many of them. But if we look now at the classical models of the strict information here, the strict information itself is not conflicting. The strict information would only be conflicting if we would add the defeasible information to it, because then all material implications would be triggered. But now we are looking only at models of the strict information, and these are different models. So as you can see, they differ here, for instance, in the way they make certain assumptions true or not true. And now we can order these models exactly in the way as I explained. A model is better if it makes more defeasible assumptions true than another one. And this is the way this is the ordering which we get. The worst one is this one here. It makes no defeasible assumptions true. So the defeasible assumption have a negation here. Here I write them without. Sorry for the confusion. But M7 is the worst. Everything is abnormal here. And then the best models are the ones which just make one assumption true. Sorry, 2 of them. and make one false. So these are the best models. And in the approach preferred models, one would select these 3 models as the preferred models. So this would be our consistent chunk of information. And now we would look at what conclusions are common in all of these 3 models. And this would be what is defeasibly entailed. So this is yet another, at first sight, very different approach to the accumulation method and a very different approach as compared to the argumentation method. However, here comes the thing. It actually is quite intimately connected. So for instance, in adaptive logics, they provide a dynamic proof theory to this type of semantic approaches. So they give a syntax and a proof theory to this kind of approach based on preferred models. There is also a very close connection between default assumptions. So this was maximal consistent subset based on defeasible and strict assumptions. And the semantic approach, as I just presented it, it basically expresses exactly the same. What is a model in the one approach will be a maximal consistent subset in the other approach. And it will characterize exactly the same type of entailment. And there is a connection to logical argumentation. You could say it's via the default assumptions because we can show that we have the same entailment. We can characterize the same entailment as default assumptions, even based on different types of Tarskian logics, not just classical logic. And therefore, we also get a characterization of the semantical entailment based on preferred models. Okay, and there is also a connection to ASPIC, as we have established in this paper. Which should not be so surprising. If you can characterize it in logical argumentation, then you can also do so in ASPIC because it gives you simply even more flavor, so to say. Okay, so let me conclude my part. I already talked a bit about the future work for dynamic derivations. I will skip this, but there is, of course, there's lots of stuff which we would like to look at, or we would like other people to look at in the future for logical argumentation. For instance, logical argumentation could get more expressive power. For instance, we don't have yet an approach to defeasible rules. So is there a way to model genuinely defeasible rules in sequence-based argumentation or in logical argumentation more generally? Is there a way to translate default logic, as in a writer's default logic, which has genuine primitive defeasible rules, or input-output logics, all of them? We characterized now one of them, but there are many, many more. Is there a systematic way of characterizing them as instances of logical argumentation? The elimination rules have a bit of a funny status currently in the proof procedures. Namely, if you have if you think about a derivation and you apply an elimination rule, it will always be the last rule applied because we don't have ways of chaining elimination rules. However, there are very natural ways of chaining elimination rules. So suppose you have an argument which is eliminated, so an elimination sequence, and you have an argument which has a logically equivalent support set or the same support set. Then you could say, okay, if I have this one sequence eliminated and I have another one which has a logically equivalent support set, then the one with the logically equivalent support set should also be eliminated. So you could say if one is delimited, another one should be delimited under certain conditions. This would be a way of chaining elimination rules. This is something which we didn't look at yet, but I think it's a very natural way of thinking about extending the already enriched calculi with which we work by further elimination rules, by chaining elimination rules, or maybe even chaining elimination rules with normal rules and looking at hybrid calculi, which really interact, older rules interact with one another. And of course, one can always look at applications. We have been mostly focusing on meta-theoretic and theoretical studies. We have some applications like in deontic logic, which look very promising because they gave rise to new types of attack rules, as Ofer has been presenting. But of course, there are many other logics as we can characterize basically anything as an instance of formal argumentation which has an adequate sequence calculus. Lots of opportunities open, so to say. One would be fuzzy logics, probabilistic logics, etc., etc. Another thing is Annemarie is currently one of our very frequent collaborators, is currently working a lot on explanations in the context of structured augmentation. Explanation is a big issue currently in XAI, also in symbolic artificial intelligence. And so it was natural to think about explanations also in the context of sequence-based augmentation. So this is something else which would be quite interesting to look at. But this is just some pointers to future work. There are many, many more. I'm sure Ofer would have many other ideas as well to add to this slide. But let me close on that. We are of course always looking for potential collaborators, or we are also very happy if you want to pick up some open threads on these future research ideas. Yeah, with that, I think I would finish my talk and open the Q&A. We thank you very much for your participation in this tutorial. You of course can contact us with questions, ideas, etc. Write us a mail. We're very happy about that.